This is AMTV. Hello there everyone, and welcome to the 5th compilation edition of this series, looking at the history and impact of Doctor Who viewing figures. If you're joining us for the very first time, a very warm welcome to you. We hope you stick around for future instalments and check out our previous compilations. We've covered the first 4 Doctor's eras, but for now, sit back, relax, and join me once again as we delve back into the wonderfully niche world of Doctor Who viewing figures. Our destination? The 5th Doctor's era. It's the Christmas of 1981, and Doctor Who was gearing up for another imminent return to television screens, its 19th season beginning in the January of 1982. But with this new run of adventures, several new changes were being showcased for the first time. Producer John Nathan Turner had already overhauled Doctor Who massively the previous year, with Season 18 bringing in new titles, a new version of the theme tune, a new look for the Doctor and the TARDIS, and a whole slew of new companions, as well as a brand new incarnation of the Malevolent Master. But that season also saw the departure of 4th Doctor, Tom Baker, bowing out after an unprecedented 7-year streak. The man to replace him was Peter Davison. Cast at the age of 29, Davison was the youngest actor yet to take on the role, and many viewers and critics cited that he was, in fact, too young, despite only seeing a few seconds of him on screen. I wonder if that would ever repeat itself in the show's future. But despite any criticisms, the new 5th Doctor, together with his 3 companions, Adric, Nyssa and Tegan, began their new adventures through time and space, and would encounter brand new enemies, as well as a few familiar faces along the way. However, things would be a little different. For the first time in its 18-year history, Doctor Who wouldn't be broadcast in its traditional Saturday tea time slot. There were 2 major reasons behind this, one being that Season 18 had fared disastrously in that particular time slot against strong competition, and the second being that the BBC was studying early evening weekday viewing to eventually launch a new soap opera. As such, to broadcast Doctor Who in this way would be a good test for the Beeb in both their study and also to see whether the programme could continue to prove popular despite the new day and time slot. But did this shift work? Or would it continue to push viewing figures ever lower for Doctor Who? And what about John Nathan Turner? If he was all about bringing in the new, then what did he have up his sleeve for his second season as producer? Well, let's dive right into Season 19 and find out. The first story from Season 19 is Castrovalva. The Doctor's regeneration is failing. Narrowly escaping death at the hands of the Master, the time travellers take refuge in Castrovalva, where not all is as it seems. A dark plan could end the 5th Doctor's life before it has even begun. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 4th of January 1982 and concluded on the 12th of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and well, what can I say, this is much more like it. A massive improvement when compared to the opener for Season 18, The Leisure Hive, which couldn't even crack 6 million viewers. Castrovalva, on the other hand, has all of its episodes attain more than 8 million viewers, with parts 3 and 4 even crossing over the coveted 10 million mark, finishing with 10.2 and 10.4 million households tuning in respectively. For the top 40 TV programmes chart, whilst no episode managed to crack it, some of them came very close. Parts 3 and 4 in particular did come the closest, charting at 47th and 46th respectively. So how did Castrovalva manage to catapult Doctor Who's viewing figures back into the highs of the Tom Baker era? Well, let's go to one of our regular factors that we analyse in this series, promotion. With the arrival of Peter Davison as the 5th Doctor, promotion for the programme remained just as present for the start of its first series as it had been for his casting announcement back in late 1980. The Radio Times, the leading listings magazine, whilst not giving Doctor Who the coveted front cover, dedicated one of its main pages with a colour photo of Davison with the TARDIS and a lengthy article promoting the start of Season 19 on BBC One. It's quite a shame that Doctor Who didn't get a Radio Times front cover for this moment. The series hadn't received one since the mid-70s, and even by 1982, a programme gaining the spot on the front cover was quite the achievement and a very helpful marketing boost. However, promotional efforts for Doctor Who were firing just as much on TV as they were in the print world, the shining example being an appearance from Peter Davison on leading Saturday morning children's show The Multicoloured Swap Shop, which aired halfway through Castrovalva's broadcast run. But what about the other main factor we look at, competition? ITV had absolutely triumphed over Doctor Who the previous year, thanks to the extreme popularity of American sci-fi import Buck Rogers in the 25th Century. But now, with Doctor Who going out on Mondays and Tuesdays as opposed to Saturdays, could the other side triumph again? Well, on Mondays, the Time Lord was facing off against the holiday programme, Wish You Were Here, and on Tuesdays, first Give Us a Clue for Part 2, and then Emmerdale Farm in most regions for Part 4. Despite the popularity of ITV's soap, the fact that Part 4 of Castrovalva still had more than 10 million viewers tuning in is quite impressive. Outside of promotion and competition, I think there are a few more unique factors that helped the Fifth Doctor attain such a strong debut. For one, the arrival of a new Doctor prompted a certain kind of buzz amongst the viewing public. It's fair to say that the idea of a new Doctor was common knowledge, and given Davison's popularity with audiences in programmes such as All Creatures Great and Small, I think it's reasonable to suggest that a great deal more people would have tuned in out of curiosity to see how the man they knew as friendly Yorkshire vet Tristan transitioned over to piloting the TARDIS. Furthermore, it's important to note the new time slot Doctor Who was going out in. Over the previous 18 years, the programme had typically begun airing anywhere from just after 5 to around 6:30 in the evening. With season 19, however, Doctor Who would air just before, just after, or precisely at 7 PM. This may have seemed a tad later for the more traditional viewer, but 7 PM was considered to be a prime-time slot by the industry, and I think that Reputation did pay due diligence to Doctor Who here, that despite the later time, multitudes of new viewers were tuning in to see the Fifth Doctor's new adventures. Whether these unique factors can sustain the viewing figures to this height, we'll have to see as we go. Castrovalva in itself is quite a fascinating story. It's a new kind of tale like no other in my view, and for that reason it stands out quite strongly. Despite the first 2 episodes largely featuring the leads in the TARDIS, the concepts and ideas explored are really unique and new territory for the programme. Christopher H. Bidmead, the script editor last season, returns to pen Castrovalva, just as he had written the swan song for the 4th Doctor, Logopolis. And whilst I did love Logopolis for its more sombre tone, Castrovalva feels like a breath of fresh air. We have a new Doctor, full of energy, raring to go, and overall the story has an air of jubilation and joy to it, that in many ways I felt was lacking from the previous season. The 3 companions continue to expand their dynamic with each other, and indeed the new Doctor, whilst Anthony Ainley's presence as the Master continues to be both maniacal and very entertaining to watch. I would say all Doctor's first stories are a must-watch, and with Castrovalva, there's absolutely no exception. Overall, this story attracted an average of 9.6 million viewers, a huge 4.5 increase from the previous season opener, The Leisure Hive. It's clear to see that the change in broadcast date and time slot, the relatively weaker competition, strong promotion, and the arrival of a new Doctor all jointly contributed to giving Castrovalva these impressive numbers. And it also meant that season 19 started off with a huge bang rather than the whimper we experienced last year. Some of the concepts outlined in Castrovalva may have been a bit too tricky or elaborate for the production team to realise, mainly due to the technical restraints and budgets of the time, but having said that, we do get a solid adventure in 4 parts. Peter is the Doctor almost from the word go, and in his recovery to finding his costume, pacing about Castrovalva, he really succeeds in crafting a character all his own right within his very first story. And if you want to witness this fresh start for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1983, or its audio adaptation from 2010. To watch it, you have the VHS release from 1992, and also a DVD release from 2007, packaged together with The Keeper of Traken and Logopolis as part of the New Beginnings box set. The Fifth Doctor's debut can also be enjoyed on Blu-ray, as part of the Season 19 collection set, released in 2018. It may not be to everyone's taste, as some find it dull or a bit too ambitious, but I love Castrovalva for what it represents. It represents a major change, a fresh start for our leading character, a chance to recapture the sense of wonder that exploring the universe holds, whilst providing great moments of wit, humour, and drama. Definitely watch it if you haven't seen it before, and whether you love it or hate it, I doubt it's one that you'll forget in a hurry.
That's the trouble with regeneration. You never quite know what you're going to get.
The second story from Season 19 is to Doomsday. Aboard a vast starship en route to Earth, the Doctor encounters the frog-like Urbankans and their leader, Monarch. The ship's passengers are drawn from different Earth cultures, but what secret do they possess? And what is Monarch's true purpose? This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 18th of January 1982 and concluded on the 26th of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and things seem to have decreased somewhat from the previous story. No episode this time makes it over 10 million, but that doesn't mean what to Doomsday did achieve wasn't impressive. All episodes like Castrovalva pulled in over 8 million viewers, and the peak of the story comes with Part 4, which had 9.4 million households watching. Not bad at all for a Tuesday evening. When looking at the top 40 programmes, Doctor Who sadly was falling further behind from that benchmark. Part 4 came the closest, finishing at 53rd, with Part 1 falling the furthest away at 66th place. Hopefully we won't have all of Season 19's stories miss the top 40, which is sadly what occurred in the previous set of stories. So if Castrovalva provided a really strong start for the Fifth Doctor's inaugural year, what was it about 4 to Doomsday to cause those numbers to begin slipping? Well, one factor that could have definitely contributed would be the promotion, or should I say the lack of promotion. In the print world, 4 to Doomsday only received one monochrome photo of the Monarch, which was printed alongside the listings for Part 3. That aside, there was no special articles, no interviews with guest stars or the leads, and even on television there was virtually nothing to promote 4 to Doomsday, outside of the normal continuity announcements and lineup previews. Competition over at ITV was for the most part exactly what had faced Castrovalva. Wish You Were Here on Mondays, and now predominantly Emmerdale Farm on Tuesdays. And whilst the soap was very popular, it was yet to broadcast all year round as it does now, and yet attain the massive surge in audiences it would receive thanks to a revamp in the late 1980s. This arguably offers a reason as to why 4 to Doomsday, and Doctor Who as a whole, was able to go toe-to-toe with Emmerdale at this time, rather than suffering a crushing defeat to a more major soap opera like Coronation Street. But more on that when we get there. Whilst 4 to Doomsday may have had one of the worst promotional runs of the last few years, does that mean that the story itself is worth passing over? Well, I think it's fair to say that some people would say yes. This story does have some interesting ideas, but a lot of the time feels like the actors are running about the studio with not a great deal happening. Interestingly, 4 to Doomsday was the first story of Season 19 to be recorded, meaning that this was the first time that Peter Davison was getting the chance to play and develop his version of the title character. And in some moments, it does show, as the Fifth Doctor exhibits traits that don't necessarily crop up too often again. So, whilst 4 to Doomsday may be one of the more underwhelming tales from Season 19, like all Who adventures, it's worth at least one go. Who knows, you may even be surprised, and it could even become your new favourite. Overall, this story attracted an average of 8.9 million viewers, a 0.7 drop from the previous story. This decline was to be expected to some degree, I guess. After the initial buzz and excitement of a new Doctor arriving had worn off, some of the more casual viewers who perhaps weren't taken in with Castrovalva were bound to drop away. But for this often overlooked story to have still brought in nearly 9 million viewers on average, that's hardly a feat to be sniffed at. These days, I find 4 to Doomsday more interesting to watch for the sake of context. Being that this was the first one Peter Davison filmed, it is fascinating to see the small ways in which his Doctor does differ in this story to say others like Castrovalva or later tales like Earthshock. It's not one I revisit often, but like all Doctor Who adventures, it does have its fans. And to see if you'll become one of them, you can read the Target book from 1983 or its audio adaptation from 2017. To watch it, it was released first on VHS back in 2001, and then later as a standalone DVD in 2008. You can also enjoy 4 to Doomsday on Blu-ray, as part of the Season 19 collection set. Whilst not necessarily being essential viewing, 4 to Doomsday is a fun little romp for the TARDIS team. We get some little great moments, and a not too shabby looking space scene towards the end. If you're a Fifth Doctor completionist, then it's one you have to check out. If you aren't, well, give it a chance anyway. It's certainly not boring to sit back and experience.
Oh, we've got to get out of here. We've got to get to the TARDIS and get out of here.
Not yet. Please, will you stop thinking of yourself for
I'm not
once?
thinking of myself. We've got to get to Earth and warn them.
Of what? Who'll believe us? We'll be laughed at.
The third story from Season 19 is Kinder. On the paradise world of Diva Loca, evil lurks in the dark places of the inside. While the Doctor and Adric are prisoners of the planetary survey team, Tegan faces the sinister Mara in a nightmare world. A nightmare that's about to become terrifying reality. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 1st of February 1982 and concluded on the 9th of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, which are almost exactly the same as they were to 4 to Doomsday. Kinder in fact replicates the previous story's peak in viewership, with Part 2 having 9.4 million audience members tuning in. It is reassuring to see the viewing figures hold steady as the season progresses, and whilst they aren't steadily falling, like they were in the first half of Season 18, it would be nice to see them rise, building to the season finale in a few months' time. For the top 40 TV programmes, Kinder wasn't able to take Doctor Who back into the coveted chart. Part 2 was able to come the closest, eventually finishing off at 45th place, whilst Part 1 ended up the furthest away at 78th. With numbers holding relatively stable for Kinder, were those audiences becoming accustomed to the TARDIS team's new adventures, or was there something in Kinder specifically that kept them glued to the screen? This serial did boast some wonderful guest stars, including Richard Todd and Nerys Hughes, but you'd hardly know they appeared in the lead up to Kinder's transmission, for there was no special piece of promotion that celebrated their appearance. In the past, entire articles have been devoted to guest actors appearing in Doctor Who, but for Kinder at least, that didn't seem to happen. Whilst the print world of promotion continued to be lacking, there was a small boost from the TV world. Throughout Kinder's transmission, Peter Davison made 2 appearances on the hit game show Call My Bluff, which, whilst not directly tied to Doctor Who, it's arguable that the star's appearance could have helped boost interest somewhat. More interesting was a BBC Schools programme, The Music Arcade, that aired on the day of Part 2's broadcast. In this show was a segment featuring Peter Howell, the composer of the series' title music. Howell demonstrated to audiences how the sequence was put together, and for anyone interested not just in Doctor Who, but electronic music as a whole, it is a fascinating watch. Moving on to Kinder's competition, the other side continued to provide the same lineup, constituting of Wish You Were Here on Mondays, and Now Back to Give Us a Clue on Tuesdays, the celebrity charade show still proving to have some appeal across the ITV regions. But even though Doctor Who was proving to be a success in the weekday evening time slot, there were many members of the public who expressed frustration that the show was no longer going out at Saturday tea time. However, head of programme planning, John Morrell, was quick to rebuttal this, by claiming the move was made as the series needed a new lease of life. To that end, Kinder complements this new lease of life with a story that is vastly original and is arguably some of the best work of the entire Peter Davison era. It's great to see Tegan, the newest of the 3 companions, really get some good character work here, and Janet Fielding's performance, particularly when she's possessed by the fiendish Mara, is absolutely stunning. Some claim not to understand it or get why it's so revered, which is completely fine, but if you ask me, this is an absolute must-watch if you're treading through the Peter Davison years. Though, if you have a fear of snakes, maybe give it a skip. Overall, this story attracted an average of 8.8 million viewers, a 0.1 drop from the previous story. This average continues the stabilisation of the viewing figures that we saw with the individual episodes, and for your programme's average to be consistently hovering close to the 9 million mark, indeed when the programme in question is over 18 years old, is quite the achievement to say the least. We also have some repeat data for you. Given the Doctor Who was now off the air for 9 months of the year, having repeats was arguably more essential than ever to keep the show in the public eye. As such, Kinder was one of 3 stories from season 19 to get a repeat airing in the summer of 1983, though this one was a last-minute addition. Airing over 4 consecutive days from the 22nd to the 25th of August, 1983, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 4.4 million viewers, exactly half of the amount who tuned in on original broadcast. In the now traditional vein of summer repeats, the viewing figures are lower for 2 key reasons. The first was the hot summer weather, that kept audiences outside for longer, making it less likely that they were in watching the telly, and second, competition on ITV remained fierce, with soap opera Crossroads proving that a little bit more popular in this instance than the TARDIS team. Kinder stands out as not being just a typical run-of-the-mill adventure. The script by newcomer Christopher Bailey is brimming with wonderful ideas and some excellent scenes, many of which are realised beautifully on the television screen. To experience the wonders of Kinder for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1983, but there's no audio adaptation of it as of yet. However, there is an abridged audio version of the novelisation, released on cassette tape, all the way back in 1997. To watch Kinder, you can check out the VHS release from 1994, or the DVD release from 2011, packaged with Snakedance as part of the Mara Tales box set. Kinder is also available to enjoy on Blu-ray, as part of the Season 19 collection set. Whilst it may not reach out to everyone, I find Kinder to be one of the more experimental stories of the 1980s. It isn't afraid to really push the boat out in terms of abstract and in some cases quite chilling concepts. And when all of your cast are on form and the production values are looking good, it really lifts the story higher. I say all the production values look good, there is, well, that, but that aside, Kinder is one I highly recommend, as long as you don't mind snakes. Again, perhaps not one for you if you really don't like them.
Oh no! Oh, is that...
Well, we've established one thing.
What?
The Kinder have a sense of humour.
The 4th story from Season 19 is The Visitation. The Doctor, Tegan, Nyssa and Adric arrive in England in 1666. There, they meet thespian Richard Mace, with whom they join forces to thwart the plans of a maroon pteroleptal who intends to wipe out human life on Earth with a virus-like plague. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 15th of February 1982 and concluded on the 23rd of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and this is a nice little jump up. All 4 parts of The Visitation gain over 9 million viewers, the first story of Season 19 to do so, and Part 4 once again takes us past the 10 million mark and finished with around 10.1 million households tuning in to witness the Doctor's part in the Great Fire of London. This is the positive boost I was talking about, with around 1 million more people dipping into the programme during The Visitation's run. For the top 40 TV programmes, Doctor Who just managed to scrape back in at the lowest position possible, with Part 4 charting at 40th place. Parts 2 and 3 came close, finishing at 48th and 41st respectively, and Part 1 falling a little further behind at 54th. So, with this nice little increase in overall viewing figures, what was it about The Visitation that caused these new audience members to tune in? Well, for a start, the competition over at ITV was mostly the same as it was for the previous stories. Some regional programming, and Wish You Were Here on Mondays, with Emmerdale Farm now taking the Tuesday slot in most ITV regions. Though I must admit, the way ITV would change up their Tuesday schedule seemingly by the week is quite surprising, but then the regionalised structure of the network at the time would often result in this. Like with 4 to Doomsday and Kinder, there wasn't a great amount of promotion for The Visitation. The BBC issued some materials in late 1981, highlighting the guest appearance of Michael Robbins as well as the monsters, the Pteroleptals, and their android. Aside from that, there wasn't any big TV appearance or article in the newspapers that actively tried to keep Doctor Who in the spotlight. Perhaps the switch to a 3-month-long season as opposed to 6 months made the BBC feel that they didn't have to sustain the promotional arm for as long. Though, it has to be said, this theory is purely speculation. Whilst being set in the 17th century, The Visitation is far from being what is termed as a pure historical. There's a lot of sci-fi in here, no less from the appearance of the alien Pteroleptal. But this pseudo-historical adventure is one of the best the classic series has to offer. The leading cast are firing off on all cylinders, Michael Robbins is hilarious as Richard Mace, and overall the story moves at quite the pace. By its end, we witness the beginnings of the Great Fire of London, revisiting a notion that some of the memorable moments in history were in some way caused or started by the Doctor. The Visitation is also notable for the destruction of the sonic screwdriver. The device had been featured constantly since its first appearance back in 1968, but the production team felt it had solved far too many a problem. And so, just like K9 beforehand, the sonic screwdriver had to go, and indeed wouldn't be seen again in the programme for another 14 years. Overall, this story attracted an average of 9.6 million viewers, a 0.8 increase from the previous story. The Visitation now ties with Castrovalva for being the highest viewed story of Season 19 thus far, and what a worthy tale to share that title with. Whether it was the historical setting, the fabulous guest cast, or the unique new aliens, The Visitation's increased viewership only strengthened the notion that the new Doctor in the new time slot was working. We also have some repeat data for you. The Visitation was chosen as one of 3 stories to be repeated in the summer of 1983. Airing over 4 consecutive days from the 15th to the 18th of August, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 4.3 million viewers. A 5.3 million drop from original broadcast. Similar to the Kinder repeat we looked at earlier, the same factors affected The Visitation also. Hot summer weather, as well as Crossroads continuing to prove its popularity amongst the general viewing public. The Visitation would be the first of the many pseudo-historical stories that viewers would be treated to throughout the 1980s. And for me, it is definitely one of the best. Penned by incoming script editor Eric Saywood, it would give audiences an insight into how this new writer would craft a Doctor Who adventure. And whilst The Visitation isn't my favourite of Saywood's scripts, I believe it offers a promising insight into what will come over the next few years. If you wish to indulge in The Visitation for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1982, or its audio adaptation from 2012. To watch it, you have a VHS release from 1994, bundled together with Black Orchid. Alternatively, there is a standalone DVD release, which first came out in 2004, before being re-released with new restoration and special features in 2013, marketed as the Special Edition. The Visitation is also available to watch on the Season 19 collection set, which is exclusive to the Blu-ray format. For those who find the pure historicals of the 1960s not to their liking, The Visitation offers an alternative that satisfies in many different categories. It has the rich historical setting that a BBC production can pull off so well, it has the science fiction elements of aliens and androids that both look unique and hold their own menace, and to top it all off, it's supported by a cast who you can tell are enjoying the material they're being given, and they're engaging with the story and the stakes that it holds and all the set pieces that it can create. Another must-watch of the Peter Davison era for me, and I hope it becomes one for you too.
Isn't my day, is it? I feel as though you've just killed an old friend.
The fifth story from Season 19 is Black Orchid. In England, 1925, the Doctor wins a cricket match and is invited to a fancy dress ball at Cranleigh Hall. But the Cranleigh family hides a dark secret, and the party mood is soon shattered when a murder is discovered. This story is comprised of 2 episodes, which began airing on the 1st of March 1982 and concluded the following day on the 2nd of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for both episodes, and those numbers just keep on climbing. The viewing figures between the 2 parts are so agonisingly close together, with Part 2 beating out Part 1 ever so slightly, with 10.1 million viewers tuning in. Part 1 trails very closely behind, with 9.9 million households watching the opening instalment. For a shorter 2-part story, for around 10 million viewers to be watching is a lovely little achievement. In regard to the top 40 TV programmes, both parts sadly miss out on a place within the chart. Part 1 finishes at 57th, whilst Part 2 inches a little bit higher, closing off at 55th place. So, how did Black Orchid manage to gain some of the highest viewing figures of the season, despite being half the length of all the preceding stories? Well, thankfully, promotion for this story saw a vast improvement over many of the previous tales of Season 19. In the TV world, a section of Black Orchid was previewed back in the December of 1981, as part of children's magazine show Blue Peter. The clip used was part of the dance sequence in Part 1, as the Blue Peter team were doing a film report about the costumers, Bermans and Nathans. Bringing things back up to speed, the Saturday before Part 1's transmission saw the Daily Mail promoting the appearance of guest star Barbara Murray, and the magazine Titbits offered a 2-page colour spread on Doctor Who, featuring an interview with one of the main stars, Janet Fielding, who dramatically teased Tegan's fate at the end of the season, stating that Tegan is left in a will she won't she escape cliffhanger. That certainly sounds enticing and interesting, but more on that when we get there. Over on the other side at ITV, competition was beginning to change up a bit. Whilst Emmerdale Farm was back facing Doctor Who on Tuesdays, on Mondays Doctor Who went against bits of the ITV News, Nature Watch, and also one of the network's highest rated shows, Crossroads. When pitted against this show before, mainly via summer repeats, Doctor Who typically lost out to the staff of the famous motel. However, it seems on this occasion, audiences were remaining loyal to the Time Lord. A relief in a way, as the popularity of Crossroads could have potentially seen millions switch channels to the other side. Black Orchid is a sharp little tale told across 50 minutes. It was the first 2-part story since 1975's The Sontaran Experiment, and whilst 2-parters in Classic Who are relatively uncommon, it doesn't mean that they can't work. It's not one of my favourites. I'm not a huge fan of the 1920s upper-class setting, but there are many parts of the serial that really do succeed. Namely the costumes of the day, which the BBC had a stellar reputation for delivering on, and the sense of fun that pervades much of Part 1. In many respects, I'm glad it's just 2 parts, as I think a 4-part structure would have dragged things out, and even though it's not one I revisit often, I still recognise its strengths, as do the many millions who absolutely adore it. Overall, this story attracted an average of 10 million viewers, a 0.4 increase from the previous story. This means Black Orchid now takes the title of being the highest viewed story of Season 19 thus far, and marking the first time Doctor Who averaged 10 million since The Creature from the Pit back in 1979. This average feels like a statement, a testament to not only the programme's enduring popularity, but that as the world entered the 1980s properly, Doctor Who still very much had a place within the TV schedules. We also have some repeat data for you. Black Orchid was the last of 3 stories to get a repeat airing in the summer of 1983. Going out on the 31st of August and the 1st of September, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 4.7 million viewers, a 5.3 million drop from the original broadcast. This repeat was going out against soap opera Crossroads and some regional news programmes, just as the other 2 repeated stories did. Plus, the summer weather in the UK made it so audiences were less inclined to catch a repeat and more tempted to catch a tan. Black Orchid may not be my favourite 2-parter of the classic series, but its relatively straightforward style has held great appeal amongst fans over the years. Whether it's the beautiful costumes, the whodunit style plotline, or even just the fact that you can breeze through it in under an hour, the serial manages to cater to a wide variety of the audience demographic. To see whether it caters to you, you can read the Target book from 1986, or its audio adaptation from 2008. To watch it, you have the 1994 VHS release, which bundles the story with the Visitation. Alternatively, you can enjoy it via a standalone DVD release from 2008. Black Orchid is also available on Blu-ray, thanks to the 2018 release of the Season 19 collection set. With 10 million viewers tuning in, Black Orchid stands as being one of the definitive successes from Season 19, especially from a viewing figures standpoint. So if you have 50 minutes spare, dig out your period piece costume, put on your dancing shoes, and get out on the patio for a wee jig. Or you can do an Adric and eat everything in sight. I mean, that's completely valid too.
Oh, well bowled!
The sixth and penultimate story from Season 19 is Earthshock. The TARDIS arrives on Earth just in time for the Doctor to foil a plot by the Cybermen to destroy the planet. But the Cybermen have a backup plan, and not everyone will survive the fight against them to save the world. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 8th of March 1982 and concluded on the 16th of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and whilst no single episode is able to break 10 million, these numbers are still very impressive and consistent with most of Season 19 thus far. Part 3 heralds the peak viewership, with 9.8 million viewers tuning in, and Part 2 saw the lowest point, with 8.8 million, which quite frankly is still a very strong figure to boast on a Tuesday evening. When looking at the top 40 programmes, Doctor Who was finally once again able to make a bit more of a dent in the charts. Part 4 scrapes in at 40th place, but Part 3 pushes its way higher up the chart, finishing at 32nd. And even though Parts 1 and 2 miss out on a place, it's not by all that much. So how did Earthshock manage to continually sustain its viewership throughout its 4 episodes? Well, the answer may seem obvious to those who know this story, but we'll come to that in just a bit. To start with, competition over at ITV was once again virtually the same as with previous stories. Wish You Were Here went out on Mondays, and Emmerdale Farm on Tuesdays, both of which had their loyal audiences of course, but failed in stealing more sizable viewership away from Doctor Who. Publicity on the other hand was a bit quieter to start with, although this time there was actually a justified reason. Earthshock was the story to bring back the Cybermen, one of the most popular monsters in all of Doctor Who. The creatures hadn't been seen on screens for around 7 years, and this time they were back with a new design, new voice, and a whole new kind of menace. But producer John Nathan Turner wanted to keep the Cybermen's return a secret for as long as possible. He had the viewing galleries blacked out when the serial was recording, and he even went as far as to turn down a front cover opportunity for the Radio Times, something which could have been seen as a risky move. However, I think it's fair to say that his gamble paid off. The Cybermen were revealed at the end of Part 1, and even though audiences dipped slightly for Part 2, by Part 3 a million more viewers were tuning in. The return of the metal monsters now out in the open, and being circulated around playgrounds and offices alike. Earthshock did eventually receive a back page article in the Radio Times promoting the Cybermen's comeback, and between Parts 2 and 3, a clip from the serial, as well as many clips from throughout the show's history, were featured on the BBC Two review programme Did You See? Peter Davison also gave an interview on popular chat show Pebble Mill at 1, mostly to promote his new book, Peter Davison's Book of Alien Monsters, but throughout the interview, clips from Earthshock were shown. By initially keeping it a secret, the return of the Cybermen heralded much press and viewer attention, generating a certain excitement for Doctor Who that had arguably been missing for some years. Earthshock is an excellent story in its own right too. Not only are the Cybermen back, but we get some wonderful action pieces, atmospheric environments, and a set of stakes that genuinely feel tense and build naturally to an explosive conclusion. The serial was also notable for the departure of companion Adric. Having felt 3 in the TARDIS was a bit too many, producer JNT decreed 1 had to go. Adric ultimately was chosen, and rather than simply shake hands and leave, he was to go out in a blaze of glory, the character dying at the story's conclusion. A companion dying, especially in Classic Who, is a rarity indeed, and Adric's death is handled so heartbreakingly well. Him and the Doctor being separated, him staying aboard to crack the code, and the tragedy of him never knowing whether or not he was right. It feels impactful, and to this day remains such an iconic, yet crushing moment from the programme's near 60-year history. Overall, this story attracted an average of 9.3 million viewers, a 0.7 drop from the previous story. Whilst it is a little surprising to see the average drop despite the return of the Cybermen, for their return to garner an average this high is a testament to their enduring popularity. Despite having not been on screen for 7 years, the reputation and impact of the creatures was still carried across to viewers of all ages. We also have some repeat data for you. Due to the premature ending of American import Brett Maverick, 6 50-minute slots became available, which were duly given to reruns of Doctor Who, titled under the banner Doctor Who and the Monsters. Earthshock was the last of 3 stories to transmit in this repeat season, beginning on Monday the 9th of August and concluding the following week. Here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 5.1 million viewers, a 4.2 million drop from original broadcast. These figures may seem low, and indeed they are, but I would argue this result is commendable for a few reasons. For one, the hot summer weather always brought viewing figures lower down across all channels, but more noticeably, the Earthshock repeat went out against ITV's most popular and longest running soap opera, Coronation Street. This show was a ratings juggernaut, and had been since it began all the way back in 1960. But whilst triumphing over Doctor Who this time, considering it was fighting a repeat, it wasn't that noteworthy. However, this wouldn't be the last time the Doctor would go up against the famous cast of The Rover's Return. Whether it's the return of the Cybermen, to witness Adric's final end, or just for a cracking good action story, Earthshock well and truly delivers. It's written by Eric Saywood, who wrote The Visitation and will become script editor on Doctor Who for several years. He carries across a darker tone, filled with death, doom and destruction, but doesn't forget to include lighter moments, perfectly encapsulating the balance that Doctor Who can do so very well in the right circumstances. So, to experience this absolute classic for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1983, or its audio adaptation from 2012. To watch it, you have a VHS release from 1992, or a standalone DVD release from 2003. Or, if you like your Blu-rays, you can enjoy Earthshock on the format as part of the Season 19 collection set. It's a classic Who story that gets talked about a lot for a reason. It was able to perfectly reintroduce the Cybermen, whilst giving a companion one of the most memorable exits in the show's history. I also think it's a great introduction in many ways to classic Who. It was one of the very first adventures I sat down to watch, and it remains just as good now as it did the first time around. I'm sure it's a story you'll love, so sit down and give it a try. Otherwise I'll never know if I was right.
My army awaits, Doctor!
The 7th and final story from Season 19 is Time Flight. When a Concorde vanishes mid-flight, the Doctor tracks it down to Earth's prehistoric past, where the crew and passengers have become the slaves of the mysterious saucer, Khalid. But who is Khalid really? This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 22nd of March 1982 and concluded on the 30th of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and here we can see quite an interesting run of events. Part 1 starts out strong, pulling in exactly 10 million viewers, but from Part 2 onwards, the serial sees quite the slump in viewership. Granted, all of the figures are above 8 million, which is a strong showing, but it is curious to see over 1 million people dive out of the story so quickly. In terms of the top 40 programmes chart, Doctor Who was able to gain a footing one last time this season, Part 1 attaining the highest chart position not just for this story, but for Season 19 as a whole, at 26th place. Parts 2 and 3 just missed out on a place, and Part 4 falls the furthest behind at 64th. Why then did viewers decide to duck out of Time Flight so quickly? Was there something specific that turned them away? Competition could have had something to do with it, even in a minimal sense. For Tuesday nights, Give Us a Clue was back on against Doctor Who, but on Mondays, holiday programme Wish You Were Here was finally pushed aside in favour of Crossroads. As mentioned previously, this soap had defeated Doctor Who in the summer seasons, and perhaps its popularity provided a conflict for some viewers who were interested in both programmes. Promotional efforts in the papers didn't make much of an event of Time Flight, though the Daily Mirror ran a small item on the show on the day of Part 1's broadcast that is mainly focused on Adric's cameo appearance in Part 2, rather than the actual plotline itself. Though on the television, Doctor Who, or rather its lead actor Peter Davison, was to be the focus of quite an important accolade. Shortly before Time Flight began transmission, JNT phoned up Peter asking him if he could make himself available to shoot a Season 19 promo for Australia. This promo would be shot on location in Trafalgar Square, with the TARDIS, Daleks and Cybermen all making an appearance. To his surprise, Peter arrived to see his 3 companions and the Master exiting the TARDIS, followed shortly by Eamon Andrews, who proclaimed to an astonished Davison, "This is your life." This show had been on and off the air since 1955, and focused on celebrating the lives of individuals in a variety of different fields. Being only 30 years old, this made Peter one of the youngest receivers of what is known as the Big Red Book. This edition was broadcast between Parts 2 and 3 of Time Flight over on ITV, and given This Is Your Life's wide audience, it could only serve as a promotional boost for Doctor Who. And indeed, Part 3 did see an audience increase of 0.4 million from Part 2. though putting this solely down to This Is Your Life is of course just a theory. Another theory relates to why Doctor Who lost 1.5 million viewers between parts 1 and 2. Given that Adric's death had been so monumental, perhaps audiences expected a chunk of the next serial to focus on the aftermath of the event. However, bar the first scene in the TARDIS in part 1 and then a cameo in part 2, Adric is all but swept aside by story's end. This partly is down to the structure and serialised nature of Doctor Who at that time, but perhaps not focusing on this big event more caused some audience members to switch off or switch over to the offerings on ITV. Time Flight itself, sadly, isn't really celebrated, both at the time and indeed even now. It is impressive in some respects, featuring a then state-of-the-art Concorde airplane and making Doctor Who the first drama to be allowed permission to film at Heathrow Airport. That aside, a lot of the story elements, props and effects aren't realised to the best quality. We must forgive it to some extent, as by the time Time Flight began production, the budget was all but running out for the season. Furthermore, it seems that certain production team members and BBC higher-ups were more concerned with shoeing in the Concorde and Heathrow elements rather than the actual plotline at hand. We do see the Master turn up again, played once more by the wonderful Anthony Ainley, but out of his 2 appearances in Season 19, this is without a doubt the weakest. More than anything, Time Flight feels more like a novelty these days, rather than an example of a good story. It does have its fans, and I certainly don't think it's the worst kind of Who that there is, but especially coming hot off the heels of Earthshock, it almost did seem a little too destined to fail from the start. Overall, the story attracted an average of 8.9 million viewers, a 0.4 drop from the previous story. This drop hardly seems surprising, given the slump this serial experienced throughout its 4 episodes, but to be honest, despite all the adventure's misgivings and problems, the fact that it came out with a near 9 million average is certainly impressive. It may not be revered as one of the greats, and indeed it does have its fair share of issues, but if there's one thing that Time Flight does have, it's a solid slice of entertainment. I don't get bored watching this story, but it isn't one from Season 19 that I revisit with any great hurry. If you wish to revisit it for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1983, or its audio adaptation from 2021. To watch it, the story was first released on VHS back in 2000, before appearing on the DVD format in 2007, packaged together with Arc of Infinity as a double release set. Time Flight is also available on Blu-ray, thanks to the Season 19 collection set. Like any Who adventure, it's certainly worth trying at least once, but if you're coming off the heels of Earthshock and expecting this story to hold the same quality and impact, then I'm afraid you're going to be a little bit disappointed.
It's only imagination. It's the only power Khalid has left to stop us.
If you advance, you will kill me, Nissa.
So that's Season 19, the 7 stories that comprise it, and the ratings that they garnered. With the transmission of Episode 4 of Time Flight, Season 19 was brought to an end, concluding a near 3-month run, comprised of 26 episodes across 7 stories. Now, let's have a look at the story averages for this season. We can see that across its 7 adventures, that Season 19 did quite well in the viewing figures department. All 7 stories had at least 8 million people watching. Compare that to Season 18, whose peak viewership average was just below that at 7.5 million. The most successful story is Black Orchid, which had 10 million households on average watching, though it probably helped that it only had 2 episodes to average instead of 4. The least viewed story is Kinder, which had 8.8 million viewers on average, but again, that's higher than every story from Season 18, and also a great deal higher than many adventures from the late 1960s and early 1970s. In short, Doctor Who was back in the game, achieving consistently strong viewing figures, with audiences continually delighted and enthralled in the TARDIS team's travels through to space and time. Now, as we always do, let's work out the overall average for this season. By combining the average ratings for each story, we can calculate that the average viewing figures for Season 19 of Doctor Who stands at around roughly 9.3 million viewers, a lovely 3.5 million increase from the previous season's average. This is a much healthier result than Season 18, and brings Doctor Who back to the impressive form seen in the early days of the Tom Baker era. And hopefully, it convinced the BBC bosses that the radical change in Doctor, TARDIS team, and the shift in broadcast dates were all an unbridled success. In terms of Season 19's position, compared to the 18 that came before it, it charts as the 4th most viewed season of Doctor Who thus far, behind 4 Tom Baker seasons and Season 2 from William Hartnell's time. Despite the programme's age, rapidly approaching its 20th birthday, it could still pack quite a punch with the viewing public. Season 19 managed to bring Doctor Who right back to being one of the television staples. Audiences returned in their millions to witness the debut of the fresh-faced 5th Doctor, and most of that audience stuck around. To join him, Adric, Nyssa and Tegan on a series of unique and exciting adventures. We went back to the past, dabbled with some more abstract and engaging concepts, whilst also seeing the return of one of the show's most iconic adversaries, only to be punched right in the gut with the death of Adric. Season 19, if anything, really did diversify itself into trying to offer something for all kinds of viewers, and the time slot shift to Mondays and Tuesdays, although scorned by some, undoubtedly helped bring in the millions of viewers that Season 18 had struggled to hold on to. And as Time Flight concluded, we were left on a new cliffhanger. As Tegan watched the TARDIS fade away, audiences must have been left wondering, was that the end of her time on the programme? The year is 1983, and Doctor Who was gearing up to celebrate its 20th birthday. This milestone was a massive achievement for a programme that started out as somewhat of an educational sci-fi show, that evolved and became a national institution, entertaining millions upon millions of viewers week after week, and now not just in the UK, but the world over. In an era of TV where sci-fi shows were lucky to last just a few years, the fact that Doctor Who was still going, and was still popular, was certainly nothing to be shrugged at. So, how on earth do you celebrate this juggernaut's 20th? Well, producer John Nathan Turner had a few ideas. Special celebrations at Longleat, several conventions, and a special feature-length episode to be the crowning jewel of the anniversary celebrations. It was a tall order, and on top of all that, the 20th regular season of Doctor Who still had to be made and transmitted. Peter Davison was embarking on his second season as the Fifth Doctor. His debut the previous year had been received well. Audience figures were constantly reaching or hovering around the 10 million mark, and some truly standout stories, such as the season opener Castrovalva or the huge impact of Earthshock, really gave audiences stories that they weren't going to forget in a hurry. But with all the buzz and hype around this special year, would season 20 reap the rewards of the occasion? Or would it suffer and be buried under all the special celebratory events happening around it? Let's dive right in and find out. The first story from Season 20 is Arc of Infinity. As a powerful being from the antimatter universe attempts to bond with him, the Doctor is urgently summoned to Gallifrey. To prevent universal catastrophe, the Time Lords intend to execute the Doctor. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 3rd of January 1983 and concluded on the 12th of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and these are quite the dip down from what we saw back in Season 19. Whereas that season's opener had at least 8 million viewers tuning into each episode, none of Arc of Infinity's 4 parts managed to achieve the same feat. In fact, the peak viewership is held by Part 2, which had 7.3 million tuning in. The least viewed point dipping one lower, with Part 3 attaining 6.9 million. But these are the early days for Season 20. Could be a case of a slow start. In terms of the top 40 TV programmes, no episode managed to crack that particular chart. Part 2 comes the closest at 66th, and Part 3 falls the furthest away at 89th. So despite the story kicking off Doctor Who's 20th anniversary year, why were viewing figures down over 2 million from this time last year? Well, to start with, Doctor Who was once again moved around in the television schedules. Aside from Part 1, which aired on a Monday due to New Year's scheduling, the remaining odd episodes would air on Tuesdays, with even episodes going out on Wednesdays. This further experiment ultimately led into the birth and placing of one of the BBC's most iconic programmes, EastEnders, but that was still a few years away. Doctor Who was still going out close to 7 PM, so if the time of airing was similar, was it perhaps the competition that warded viewers away? ITV's offerings this time around in some ways isn't that different to what we saw last year, as Doctor Who would overlap with popular soap opera Crossroads, before also running into Emmerdale Farm on Tuesdays and This Is Your Life on Wednesdays. All 3 of these programmes were quite popular and all had their loyal audiences, as like Doctor Who, they had all been on the air for several years. Also, Season 20 marked the first time that the Time Lord had not 1, but 2 channels to contend with. The brand new Channel 4 was launched in November of 1982, and whilst typically gaining a lower audience share than the BBC or ITV, they still offered their own new and unique programming, so even if a few million were to tune in, then that would gradually mean less viewership on BBC One. Against Arc of Infinity, the new channel would compete with Lucky You, Lucky Me on Tuesdays, and Shakespeare Lives on Wednesdays, with the news also overlapping against the Time Lord on both days. So it's fair to assume that the overlap of these ITV programmes, combined with the new offerings from Channel 4, presented millions of viewers with a tough choice, particularly as most households had only one television, and repeats, whilst gradually becoming more common, were still few and far between. However, in terms of home media, the VHS format was gradually becoming more of a household fixture rather than a high-end piece of tech. Whilst prices for recorders and tapes were still quite high in 1983, those that owned them could have easily recorded Doctor Who and watched at a later date. Whereas ratings data today includes viewings from up to 28 days after original broadcast, this was certainly not the case back in the 1980s, with only live viewers taken into consideration. This is all speculative theory, but I would argue that it does hold some weight. Promotion for Arc of Infinity was also quite plentiful, primarily to boast the start of a new season of adventures. Key features that were highlighted were the Ergon, the arrival of a mysterious renegade Time Lord, and the location work that took place in Amsterdam, the second time that Doctor Who had filmed overseas. Peter Davison would make an appearance on popular children's show Saturday Superstore in the November of 1982, and shortly after, he along with his wife Sandra Dickinson and the Master himself, Anthony Ainley, would appear in John Nathan Turner's pantomime version of Cinderella, which would be very successful over the Christmas period. Though despite all this, over 2 million less people were watching. While the final factor that could have affected things is the gap between seasons. Throughout the 1960s, the gap had only been a matter of weeks. In the 1970s, the gap extended to around 6 months for the most part. But after Tom Baker's final season, the gap was widened once again, this time to 9 months. Season 19 had such a strong boost though despite this gap, but I think a lot of that was down to the audience interest in the brand new Doctor, who was already a popular actor known from other programmes. However, after that first season, those who decided they perhaps weren't taken with this version of the show, or perhaps had grown out of Doctor Who over those 9 months, or had simply moved on to watching other programmes. Again, this is all speculative, but it definitely should be considered a factor. Arc of Infinity itself, despite being a story that received a lot of hype and promotion, sadly ends up as a story with a lot of interesting ideas that maybe weren't executed in the best way. The main focal point that everyone remembers is the return of the renegade Time Lord Omega. Having originally appeared in Season 10's The Three Doctors, the return of this powerful character began the motif implemented by producer John Nathan Turner, that a feature from the show's past would return in every story of Season 20, whether that be a friend or foe. The much talked about Ergon also sadly suffers from its rather interesting design, but on the plus side, the location work in Amsterdam looks fantastic, and it's great to see Janet Fielding return as Tegan, and some of the scenes on Gallifrey work a treat. We also get to see Colin Baker play the character of Commander Maxwell, a part in which he owns completely, and I've got a funny feeling this won't be the last time we see him on our journey. Overall, this story attracted an average of 7.2 million viewers, a 2.4 million drop from the previous season opener, Castrovalva. Despite this average being fairly respectable, I would argue this is quite the blow for the show, particularly as it begins its 20th anniversary season. The newfound popularity brought in by the Fifth Doctor seems to have ebbed away quite dramatically over the 9-month break, and we can only hope it improves as Season 20 progresses. Some see it as a bit of a false start for Season 20, but Arc of Infinity does have its high points, and the Amsterdam work gives the programme the same freshness and excitement that City of Death gave in Paris 4 years prior. If you want to take a trip to the Holland capital today, you can read the Target book from 1983, or the audio adaptation from 2021. To watch it, you have a 1994 VHS release, or a DVD from 2007, bundled together with Time Flight in a double pack release. If you want to see the return of the dreaded Omega, more Time Lord shenanigans on the planet Gallifrey, and Tegan properly rejoin the TARDIS crew, then there is a lot for you here. It doesn't hit every mark, but it gets Season 20 underway, and gives us a tantalising taste of the adventures to come.
I'm sorry, Doctor.
No! You can't!
Executing me will not alter the fact there's a traitor at work on Gallifrey!
The second story from Season 20 is Snakedance. The dark evil of the Mara still exerts its influence over Tegan, and brings the TARDIS to the planet Menusa. Can the Doctor free his companion before Menusa once again falls under the dominion of the Snake? This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 18th of January 1983 and concluded on the 26th of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and the numbers don't seem to be improving for the better. Like Arc of Infinity, no episode crosses 8 million, and half of the story actually falls under 7 million, with parts 1 and 3 pulling in 6.7 and 6.6 million respectively. Whilst Part 2's 7.7 million peak is the most viewed individual episode of the season thus far, it's still a far cry from what we saw the Fifth Doctor manage in his first year. When looking at the top 40 TV programmes, Doctor Who continued to sink lower in the ranks. Part 2 has the highest placing, at 75th place, but then Part 3 almost falls into triple digits, but narrowly dodges it, finishing at 98th. So, what exactly was going on? Were these first few stories of Season 20 just not clicking with audiences? Or were other factors seriously stealing those millions away from the Time Lord? Well, when looking at the competition for Snakedance, it largely remains unchanged. The News and Crossroads continue to face Doctor Who, before the Time Lord overlapped with Emmerdale on Tuesdays and This Is Your Life on Wednesdays. The programme again aired all its 4 parts close to 7 PM, and this primetime placement I suppose must have been seen as a blessing and a curse. Doctor Who at this time was arguably exposed to the most potential television audience members, but considering the competition it went up against all had their loyal millions, often the older adults who had control of the TV remote, it meant that a loss in viewership grew ever more likely, even more so now that Channel 4 was on the scene. For promotion, there was barely anything for Snakedance outside of the regular continuity announcements and brief trailers on TV. No special guest appearances on other programmes, no sort of key features in magazines. It's honestly surprising how scarce any promotional hype is, especially as this was the 20th season, and producer John Nathan Turner was all about promoting the show in any way that he could, although he did have several plans that would come to fruition later in the year. Snakedance is sort of a sequel story to Season 19's Kinder, in that it features the return of the malicious Mara, who once again possess Tegan for their own vicious purposes. Christopher Bailey returns to write the script, and whilst this new story contains its fair share of new and exciting ideas, I feel it lacks a lot of the polish and wonder that Kinder had in spades. Janet Fielding excels as a villainous version of Tegan, and thankfully the snake effects are greatly improved from, well, this. But that aside, I honestly find Snakedance a little underwhelming. It just sort of plods along, lots and lots of talking, and not a great deal happening. The ending feels rather rushed, and there are some cast members who I feel aren't giving all that they can. On cast members though, this story does feature a very young Martyn Clunes as Lon, his very first TV role. But Doc Martin this isn't, and whilst it's a firm favourite to many, this is one Snake story that I can happily pass on. Overall, this story attracted an average of 7.1 million viewers, a 0.1 drop from the previous story. I'm glad that even though there's another drop, that it's a relatively tiny one. A 7.1 million average in 1983 for a near 20-year-old show is certainly very respectable, but I'm sure this is far from what the production team and the BBC higher-ups were hoping for. There is still time for things to improve, or by the same token, get worse. Whilst I prefer Kinder to Snakedance, there are many people who think the opposite. Both stories have their strengths, and Snakedance does have some elements I can enjoy, but ultimately, it's not a story that I revisit often. If I need my Mara fix, I'll head to Kinder. But nevertheless, if you wish to experience Snakedance for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1984, but there's no audio adaptation as of yet. However, you can watch the story either on a VHS release from 1994 or via its 2011 DVD release, bundled together with Kinder as part of the Mara Tales box set. I'm glad the Mara got a second outing, as I feel that they're one of the most underrated and threatening villains in the show's history. It's a shame that we haven't seen them return on TV, both in the classic or new series, but never say never. If there's one thing we've learned about classic monsters, it's that any of them can make a triumphant comeback. If you're not afraid of snakes, want to see a young Martyn Clunes and a scary Janet Fielding, then Snakedance is definitely the one for you.
Look at me.
The third story from Season 20 is Mawdryn Undead. The Black Guardian seeks vengeance. A group of tragic immortal mutants are desperate for death, and the Brigadier can't remember his oldest friend. Can the Doctor solve the mystery before it's too late? This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 1st of February 1983 and concluded on the 9th of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and once again, the numbers are holding steady within the 6 and 7 million ranges. Only one episode falls below the 7 million mark, which is Part 1, at 6.5 million viewers. Part 4 of the story ties with Part 2 for Snakedance as being the most viewed individual episode of the season thus far, with 7.7 million households tuning in. It's still quite surprising that for the 20th anniversary season, no individual episode so far has managed to crack even 8 million viewers, let alone 10 million. And for the top 40 TV programmes, for the 3rd time in a row, Doctor Who was miles away from that chart. Part 1 sets a new low for the season, falling into triple digits, and finishing at an abysmal 103rd place. Hopefully this will be the first and last time we see these triple figures this season. But considering this story had a lot going for it, especially as it was starting up a new trilogy, why didn't it get a little ratings boost? Competition remained firm on the opposing channels. ITV was still throwing Emmerdale and This Is Your Life against Doctor Who, and Channel 4 held steady with a regularly rotating run of different programming, none of which eclipsed the 2 older channels, but gained a small loyal audience nonetheless. Promotion was a bit more noticeable compared to what was given to Snakedance, The key feature was a back page article in the Radio Times, complete with full colour photograph and the focus on the return of Nicholas Courtney as Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart, his first appearance on the show in nearly 8 years. But the Brig's return wasn't the only factor that was focused on. There was also the arrival of a new companion. Mark Strickson joined the regulars as Turlo, an alien who ended up on Earth, but one who has fallen under the persuasion of the sinister Black Guardian. And whilst he joins the Doctor, rather than become his friend, he secretly plans to kill him. Quite unlike your typical companion. Mawdryn Undead, in a way, isn't really your typical classic Who adventure either. There's a great emphasis on different time zones, which is always a fascinating concept, but one that can get confusing and tangled really easily. The unit dating conundrum, as it became known, was established here, and I'm not going to get into it because we would be here forever, but if you want to know more about it, then check out this video from the Whoniversals. It'll hopefully explain things a bit better than I ever could. The return of the Brigadier is very much welcome though, and Nicholas Courtney puts in another wonderful performance, retaining the warmth, charm and occasional spike of the character that he first played 15 years prior. And if you're a Brigadier fan, then don't worry, we're going to see more of him later on this season. But more on that when we get there. The addition of Turlo offers a new yet different dynamic to the TARDIS team, but whilst the notion of a supposed ally wanting to kill the Doctor is interesting, that initial interest won't last forever, and is quite limiting in terms of story opportunities. The being coercing Turlo to do this is the Black Guardian, and it's a surprise return. Played once again by Valentine Dial, the actor puts in a good performance, communicating the powerful and intimidating nature of this ethereal being, but I personally wish he had had a greater presence in both this story and the two that would follow it. Having said that, if you can wrap your head around the time zone business, then Mawdryn Undead is a lot of fun to watch, and for me, it's also one of the highlights from Season 20. Overall, this story attracted an average of 7.3 million viewers, a 0.2 increase from the previous story. An increase is always welcomed in the series, but I wish it was a larger one than this. That's now 3 stories in a row that have hovered around the lower end of the 7 million range, which, I stress again, is perfectly fine, but not what you would want a programme celebrating its 20th year to achieve. To kick off a new mini-trilogy, reintroduce the Brigadier and the Black Guardian, as well as adding Turlo to the mix, Mawdryn Undead certainly has a lot going for it, and in many respects does succeed in what it sets out to do. Perhaps if it had had another episode and had spent more time working out all the times and dates, then this truly could have been one of the greatest stories of the classic series. What we get is a story that still is very entertaining and has many memorable moments, but one that also feels like it's missing one final key piece to really make it all work to the best of its ability. But to see what you make of it for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1983, or its audio adaptation from 2018. To watch it, you have a VHS release from back in 1992, or you can enjoy it via a 2009 DVD release, where it was packaged with the following 2 stories of Season 20 as the Black Guardian trilogy. Mawdryn Undead definitely is one of the high points of Season 20 for me, and out of all of the past elements brought back for the run of adventures, I feel it implements that to the best effect. The exploration and use of the Brigadier, although confusing in some aspects, is wonderful to see, and even though surprising, the Black Guardian remains just as menacing as he was from his first brief appearance at the end of the Key to Time saga. Check it out for yourself, and strap yourselves in, because this trilogy continues.
Do it now!
The 4th story from Season 20 is Terminus. Sabotaged by Turlo, the TARDIS locks onto a space liner which is carrying passengers suffering from Lazar's disease. The ship is on course for Terminus, which lies at the very centre of the known universe and offers a cure for the fatal illness. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 15th of February 1983 and concluded on the 23rd of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and the stabilisation of Season 20's numbers seemingly continue. As the 4th story in the run, you can see the pattern at this point. No episode crosses 8 million, and 2 fall below 7, with parts 1 and 3 drawing in 6.8 and 6.5 million households. We haven't crossed into dangerous territory that is sub 6 million, but the fact that Doctor Who is constantly hovering just over that line is a little worrying. For the top 40 programmes, Terminus didn't fall into triple figures, though Part 3 comes close at 97th place. Part 2 charts the highest at 75th, but it's definitely a far cry from the mid-70s, when Doctor Who would place within the top 40 week after week. So, as the Black Guardian trilogy trundled on, did Terminus continue to entice viewers, or did it turn them away? The promotional front for the story was a bit more expansive than stories like Snakedance. For one, there were articles on the guest appearance of Lisa Goddard, an actress who at the time was married to the pop star Alvin Stardust, an example of JNT's guest casting working to his favour promotionally. Doctor Who also popped up on an edition of the BBC's morning show, Breakfast Time. As part of a 60-year celebration of children's TV, numerous effects from the programme were highlighted. Competition over at both ITV and Channel 4 remained largely consistent, the other side still pushing out Crossroads, Emmerdale and This Is Your Life against Doctor Who on their corresponding days. This consistency in competition could have been a barrier for the Time Lord gaining higher viewing figures, as the loyal audiences, particularly for the soaps, were unlikely to switch their viewing habits from whatever ongoing storyline was being presented. However, after Part 4 of Terminus concluded, a special continuity announcement promoted an upcoming event at Longleat to celebrate Doctor Who's 20th anniversary. This celebration was still some months away, but the response would be more than the BBC ever dreamed of. But more on that when we get there. Terminus is a story that gets a lot of bad press from audiences. Part 1 I feel is the true highlight of the adventure. It has an atmospheric and eerie feel to it, and really presents an engaging start to this tale, before taking a dive over the following 3 instalments. Tegan and Turlough get shoehorned into an air vent for most of the story, and the focus on a leprosy-like disease prompted a lot of backlash from both viewers and also medical institutions. The monster of the serial, the Garm, also looks a little hokey, and a far cry from what writer Stephen Gallagher had intended. You may recognise that name from a few years ago, as he was the writer behind the truly unique Warrior's Gate, one of my favourite stories from Season 18. And whilst the ideas Gallagher presents in Terminus are equally as interesting, I feel that the realisation wasn't quite as strong, not helped by the various strikes going on at the BBC at the time. It's one many fans find a dull watch, but like any Who story, it does remain a favourite to some. Overall, this story attracted an average of 7.1 million viewers, a 0.2 drop from the previous story. Whilst I'm glad that the viewing figures for Season 20 are quite consistent and not taking a deep dive downwards, I still find it such a shame that they aren't a lot higher, especially after all of the returning friends and foes that popped up. Had there been more promotion or more emphasis on the 20th anniversary aspect, maybe things could have been different. Terminus is often a story people skip over, but there is one factor that many do remember and find very touching, and that is the departure of Nyssa. Sarah Sutton gives a wonderful performance in this story, and the scene in which she leaves the Doctor is quite short but also very sweet. One of the few times in the classic series in which the Doctor is given a kiss. If only he knew what was coming in his future. It's one of the most understated companion departures of the classic era, but if you want to see it for yourself, then you can read the Target book from 1983 or its audio adaptation from 2019. To watch it, you have a standalone VHS release from 1992 or a DVD release from 2009, packaged together with Mawdryn Undead and Enlightenment as part of the Black Guardian trilogy box set. If you're going through this trilogy, then Terminus is a story that you're going to have to tune into eventually. It does sort of work on its own, but a lot of it feels like a missed opportunity. It joins the rank of stories like The Space Museum, adventures that have a great opening instalment and then sort of falter from there. But if you haven't seen it, give it a go at least once. As I often say, you may even find you have a new favourite.
This is your last chance. I shall not say that again. Kill the Doctor!
The fifth and penultimate story from Season 20 is Enlightenment. The Doctor, Tegan and Turlough meet the Eternals, who are on a race through space. The ultimate prize is Enlightenment. Turlough is torn between his loyalty to the Doctor and his agreement with the Black Guardian. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 1st of March 1983 and concluded on the 9th of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and I honestly can't believe how consistent these numbers have been. I would love for them to be consistent on a higher level, but at least the show isn't bleeding viewers by the millions with each story. Part 4 of the tale saw the peak in viewership, with 7.3 million households tuning in, but yet again half of the story falls one step lower, with Part 3 setting a new low for Season 20, with 6.2 million households tuning in. We're inching ever closer to the 5 million range. Let's hope it's avoided before the season is out. When looking at the top 40 programmes, Part 3 just misses slipping into triple digits, finishing at 99th place, and Part 4 saw the highest chart position at 68th, still miles away from a spot in the top 40 itself. As this is the conclusion of the Black Guardian trilogy, was Enlightenment the big finish that audiences expected, or did it come across as a bit of a dud? Well, when looking at the promotional side of things, efforts were clearly made to hype up the story, namely via the appearance of certain guest stars. The Daily Mirror held an interview with Linda Barron, who expressed the amount of research she had done on female pirates, whilst the BBC promoted the appearance of Keith Barron as Striker. In terms of competition, once again, the other channels' offerings remain consistent with what we've seen face Season 20 thus far. Namely on ITV, the opposition of Crossroads on both days, with then Emmerdale following on Tuesdays and This Is Your Life on Wednesdays. But one thing Doctor Who did have over these other shows was the release of a brand new vinyl record. Doctor Who The Music was a single LP that collated several of the incidental music tracks heard in the show, mostly from seasons 18, 19 and 20. Released whilst Terminus was transmitting, this LP proved to be quite successful, and is an often overlooked piece of merchandise from the 20th anniversary. Speaking of said celebration, the Longleat event was frequently promoted after each episode of Enlightenment concluded its transmission, further hyping up what would be a truly extravagant event held over the Easter weekend of 1983. Back on the TV, Enlightenment is truly an odd conclusion for the Black Guardian trilogy. Whilst we do see that story strand wrapped up, the other elements are both enticing but also to some quite bewildering. The notion of a great boat race set in space is quite a wonderful concept, and this serial truly holds some of the finest model work that Classic Who had ever broadcast. It's not my favourite of the trilogy, but it's a story that I have a lot of admiration for, and had it been given a few more episodes or even a bigger budget, I feel it could have been even more impressive. Writer Barbara Clegg was the first solo female writer to contribute a script to the programme, and despite having future ideas, sadly none were ever made for television. However, some of these stories were later adapted as audio adventures by Big Finish Productions, as part of their Lost Stories range. So, whether you love it or hate it, Enlightenment certainly stands out. Whether it's the demise of the Black Guardian or the striking ship models, it's one that's hard to wipe from your memory. Overall, this story attracted an average of 6.8 million viewers, a 0.3 drop from the previous story. This is the first time in Season 20 that a story has averaged below 7 million viewers, and the first time this has happened since the 4th Doctor's swan song, Logopolis. Whilst just under 7 million is not a terrible figure, it's still a far cry from the numbers the show was bringing in this time last year. Enlightenment, though, if anything, exemplifies how different, weird and wonderful a Doctor Who story can be. While some viewers at the time derided the concept of a space boat race, I really love it, and there are many people who will cite this story as the crowning jewel of the Black Guardian trilogy. To join in the race for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1984 or its audio adaptation from 2020. To watch it, you have a standalone VHS release from 1993 or a DVD release from 2009, bundled together with Mawdryn Undead and Terminus as part of the Black Guardian trilogy box set. Whether you're swept away by the story or you can't get through it without being distracted, Enlightenment is probably one of the most recognisable stories that Season 20 gave to viewers. I really admire Barbara Clegg's writing style, though the fact it took 20 years for a solo female writer to have a script made for the programme is shocking. Go and give it a watch, join in the race, and make sure you don't bump into each other along the way.
Look at the screen. We're not on a yacht, we're on a ship. A spaceship.
The sixth and final main story from Season 20 is The King's Demons. The TARDIS arrives in 13th century England, where the Doctor, Tegan and Turlough meet King John. However, it soon becomes clear that the King is an imposter, a pawn in a plan by the Master to change the course of history. This story is comprised of 2 episodes, which began airing on the 15th of March 1983 and concluded the following day on the 16th of March. Here are the individual viewing figures for both episodes, and it's finally happened, folks. Just as we were almost done, we have an episode from Season 20 that failed to pull in 6 million viewers, with Part 1 only managing to grab 5.8 million. This is far from the lowest viewed episode of Doctor Who ever, but it is the lowest for Season 20, and very disheartening to see considering this is the programme's 20th anniversary year, a time where you would think more people than ever would be watching. Part 2 does pull in over 1 million viewers back, finishing with 7.2, but by this point, the fact that none of the 6 main season stories could pull in over 8 million is such a shame. When looking at the top 40 programmes, Part 1 expectedly falls into triple digits, finishing at 107th, and Part 2, whilst not below 100, doesn't do much better, and ended up charting at 66th. So, considering this was the season finale as it were, what was it about the King's Demons that caused it to suffer in this way? The competition could have once again been a dominating factor in these lower figures. The popular mix of Crossroads with Emmerdale on Tuesdays and This Is Your Life on Wednesdays could have been hard to resist by some members of the audience demographic. But when it came to promotion, Doctor Who was really starting to appear more frequently and prominently in both the print and TV worlds. Regarding the King's Demons specifically, the surprise appearance of the Master was kept secret in the Radio Times listings for Part 1, with Anthony Ainley's credit being changed to James Stoker, an anagram of Master's joke. Although arguably, you can tell that Sir Giles is anally right from the word go. When Part 2 concluded, a special trailer was aired to promote the event at Longleat, which would take place in just under 3 weeks' time. The event was also promoted by the 3 series regulars via an appearance on Saturday Superstore, in which viewers had the chance to win numerous Doctor Who prizes. In addition to the Longleat celebrations, news of a special feature-length episode was starting to circulate, all but confirmed and promoted on the BBC's nationwide programme. Airing the day after The King's Demons wrapped up, Peter Davison, together with John Pertwee and Patrick Troughton, appeared on the show to promote the special, titled The 5 Doctors, and the 20th anniversary. The chance to see a story with all 5 Doctors was irresistible, to say the least, but that was still many months away. The King's Demons, I'm sad to say, is a really underwhelming conclusion to the 1983 series of Doctor Who. Despite it only being 2 episodes long, it just feels very lackluster, devoid of any serious stakes or set pieces, and even though it's great to see the Master again, he doesn't really do a great deal. To be honest, had this story been 4 parts instead of 2, perhaps then we would have had a serial filled with a lot more substance than what eventually ended up on screen. We are also quickly introduced to the robot Chameleon, who may have seemed impressive somewhat back in 1983, but due to the technical hassle and limitations of the machine, he joined the TARDIS but then was very quickly forgotten about. What was meant to be a 20th anniversary year showcasing more exciting adventures in this long-running show, The King's Demons, to me at least, feels like anything but. Overall, this story attracted an average of 6.5 million viewers, a 0.3 drop from the previous story. The downward trajectory is not promising at all, and while 6.5 million may be far from the truly disastrous lows of Tom Baker's final year, again, as the finale of the 20th season, this result is really disappointing. But not all hope is lost. We still have the 20th anniversary special to look forward to. We also have some repeat data for you. To help bridge the 9-month gap between season 21 and 22, The King's Demons was selected for a repeat airing in the summer of 1984. Going out across 2 consecutive Fridays from the 6th to the 13th, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 4.2 million viewers, a 2.3 million drop from the original broadcast. These numbers are quite low when relative to 1984 standards, and the reason for this are ones that we've encountered many times before when it comes to summer repeats. The first factor was the fact that audience levels always dipped in July and August across all television channels, so that wouldn't have helped. But also, the second main factor is the competition. Now, for the last few years of summer repeats, Doctor Who would often go against some of ITV's popular soap operas, such as Crossroads, Emmerdale Farm, or even Coronation Street. However, this time, the programme would air against a very popular game show, Winner Takes All. This light-hearted entertainment was exceptionally big with family audiences in the 70s and 80s, so it seems that on this occasion, The King's Demons didn't stand much of a chance. The King's Demons isn't really talked about a great deal, and I would argue that it's quite clear to see why. Whilst the BBC can pull off the 13th century setting with some great costumes and sets, the story itself really doesn't work for me, for what little excitement it may hold within it. But to see if you can enjoy it a lot more than I do, you can read the Target book from 1986, or its audio adaptation from 2016. To watch it, The King's Demons was first released on VHS back in 1995, packaged in a special edition set, together with the 20th anniversary story, The 5 Doctors. It was later released on DVD in 2010, this time bundled with Planet of Fire as part of the Chameleon Tales box set. Outside of the return of the Master and the debut of Chameleon, there isn't much more that makes me revisit The King's Demons. Admittedly, serials set in this time period aren't really my thing, I'm more into the sci-fi fantasy, but if you like historical settings, then you may enjoy this a lot more than I did. But back in 1983, this was the last adventure fans were treated to before a long wait for the ultimate story that was to come, the 20th anniversary special.
You escaped from Zarephath.
Oh, my dear Doctor, you have been naive.
The special episode from season 20 is The 5 Doctors. The Doctor's past catches up with him when his previous incarnations, along with some old friends and foes, are drawn to the Death Zone on Gallifrey. There they all head to the Dark Tower to discover who is responsible for abducting them. This story was a 90-minute feature-length episode, which originally aired as part of that year's Children in Need, broadcast on Friday the 25th of November, 1983. Here are the viewing figures for this special episode, with 7.7 million tuning in, a 1.2 increase from the previous story. I've got to be honest though, for the special 20th anniversary episode, one that is 90 minutes long, features all of the Doctors and several companions and monsters, for it to only gain just under 8 million viewers is astonishing, and not in a good way. This episode should have been the one to take Doctor Who back over the 10 million mark. It had the potential to be one of the most viewed stories of the show's history, and yet it pulled in a very modest result. It's just baffling. More surprising is that the 5 Doctors failed to make it into the top 40 TV programmes of the week, finishing instead at 54th, which, granted, is a lot better than most other episodes of Season 20, but still, if any episode this year should have cracked the top 40, this should have been it. So, what exactly happened here? What factors were at work to result in the 5 Doctors getting these numbers? The competition this time around was completely different to what went up against the other stories from Season 20. This was partly due to the fact that the 5 Doctors was airing on a Friday as opposed to a Tuesday or Wednesday. Over the special's 90-minute runtime, Doctor Who would battle against the A-Team and A Fine Romance, both very popular shows in their day, particularly the former. It could have been this rival popularity that prevented the 5 Doctors from gaining a much higher viewership than it received. Channel 4, on the other hand, was airing such programmes as Right to Reply, The Amateur Naturalist, and A Week in Politics. Absolutely thrilling, that, isn't it? Promotion for the story was the most rampant that it had been in years, but for the 20th anniversary special, that hardly comes as a surprise. Firstly, a few weeks after The King's Demons concluded, the much-hyped event at Longleat finally came about in early April. This featured several appearances from stars of the show, past and present, including several Doctors and companions. There were sets people could see, monsters they could meet, props they could view, and much more. The event was so massive that thousands never actually made it inside due to the overwhelming demand, completely underestimated by the BBC. The Longleat celebrations, if anything, proved that Doctor Who retained a huge appeal amongst UK audiences from both children and adults. But as the months drew nearer to the 5 Doctors, the promotional efforts really began to step up a gear. One big victory for the programme was the serial getting the coveted Radio Times front cover, the first time the show had done so in a decade, though this edition received low distribution due to a printer strike occurring at the time. However, a few weeks before that edition, the Radio Times had released a special magazine dedicated to the show's 20th anniversary, and featured articles on all the eras of the show up until that point. Numerous other newspapers also published articles on the 20th anniversary special, and whether their comments were positive or negative, all of it continued to drum up the special serial for those who were waiting. There were numerous TV promotional spots as well, including cast appearances on Saturday Superstore, Blue Peter, and Pebble Mill. But perhaps the biggest shock that occurred came in August, when it was announced that Peter Davison would hand in the TARDIS keys after the next series, and that Colin Baker would be taking up the mantle of the 6th Doctor. This news was both sad for those who adored Davison, but as with any new Doctor announcement, also wonderfully exciting. And for those who had seen Colin as Maxil in Arc of Infinity, they had an insight into how good of a performance he could deliver. But his time as the Doctor was still a fair way away, so more on that when we get there. The special itself was pushed back from its original planned air date of Wednesday the 23rd of November to 2 days later, on Friday the 25th, so that it was able to be included as part of the annual Children in Need telethon that the BBC had been hosting since 1980. Whilst the decision irked producer John Nathan Turner, it was believed and hoped that the high-profile nature of the special would not only be seen as the highlight of Children in Need, but also help raise money for the various charities that the telethon supported. So, after all of the speculation, all of the promotion, after every last drop of hype was pushed into the 5 Doctors, did it all come together? I would argue for the most part, and certainly in the spirit of celebration, yes. The 5 Doctors is ultimately a celebration of the show's history thus far. All surviving Doctors make an appearance, although Tom Baker is present via stock footage from the unaired story Sharda, as he ultimately wished to not take part in the special. William Hartnell's first Doctor is survived by a truly wondrous performance from Richard Hurndall, and whilst he may not be exactly like Hartnell, I believe he greatly captures the softer, more adventurous side of his original incarnation. Hurndall's casting also opened the door several decades down the line for the notion that Doctors could be recast, something which has occurred both on TV and in the show's wide expanded universe. Sadly, this would prove to be one of Hurndall's last roles, as he died a few months after broadcast in early 1984. The story itself is absolutely jam-packed, really making use of those 90 minutes. You have a Dalek, squads of Cybermen, a barely visible Yeti, the new Rastan Warrior robot, as well as the return of the Malevolent Master, plus many of the Doctor's former companions putting in an appearance. Terence Dicks was the writer to bring this all together, the man who had script edited the show in the early 70s, and whilst some argue the 5 Doctors isn't the most cohesive story, if there was anyone who could succinctly cram all of these elements into 90 minutes, it would be Terence. The 5 Doctors was one of the first ever classic Who stories that I sat down to watch, and as a 9-year-old I was absolutely mesmerised by it. The multiple doctors, companions, monsters, just everything about it felt so magical and wondrous, and even today, effects and story beats aside, I still find it one of the most enjoyable Doctor Who stories to sit down and watch. And if you haven't seen it before, I recommend it to be one of the first classic serials that you sit down and enjoy. A pure celebration from start to finish. We also have some repeat data for you. 1 month after the King's Demons repeat, it was time for the 5 Doctors to receive the same treatment. Although this time around, instead of airing as one 90-minute long episode, it went out in 4 episodic instalments, over 4 consecutive days, from the 14th to the 17th of August 1984. Here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 4.4 million viewers, a 3.3 million drop from the original broadcast. Whilst numbers are lower, it is down to the same factors that affected the King's Demons repeat. Hot summer weather keeping audiences outside, and a varied amount of strong competition from ITV, including Crossroads, parts of the ITV News, and a selection of other programmes depending on the region that you lived in. Given that The 5 Doctors was the 20th anniversary special, it doesn't seem surprising that ever since its first broadcast, there have been numerous releases of the adventure when it came to different media. And out of the wide plethora of said releases, you can read the Target book from 1983, or its audio adaptation from 2017. To watch, it was one of the first stories to be released on the VHS format. A slightly abridged version was first issued in 1985, both on VHS and also the lesser-known Betamax format. The complete, unabridged broadcast version was released a few years later in 1990, and in 1995 it was released again, this time with the King's Demons, as part of a special edition set. It was in this release that the special edition of The 5 Doctors was first seen. This version featured primarily new music and effects, and for many has become the definitive way to experience The 5 Doctors, myself included. The special edition version, in fact, became the very first Doctor Who story to be released on the DVD format. This came out in 1999, back when DVDs and their players were still quite expensive for customers, with VHS still being the predominant format. However, just like with VHS, The 5 Doctors would be released once again to DVD, nearly 10 years later in 2008, this time dubbed as the 25th anniversary edition. This release contains both the original 1983 broadcast episode and the special edition, so this really is the definitive choice of home media releases if you want both versions. The 5 Doctors may not be the most perfect Doctor Who story, but it's arguably one of the most jubilant and most fun. Everything from the setting of the Death Zone, the meeting of classic Doctors with their companions, the monsters returning, the Master, the Time Lords, honestly, I could keep going, there is just so much to love. Despite the special status, I very much consider the 5 Doctors to be a part of Season 20, and as such, I can say that without doubt, it's absolutely my favourite adventure from the roller coaster that was Doctor Who's 20th anniversary year.
You mean you're deliberately choosing to go on the run from your own people in a rackety old TARDIS?
Why not? After all, that's how it all started.
So that's Season 20, the 7 stories that comprise it, and the ratings that they garnered. With the transmission of Episode 2 of The King's Demons, Season 20 was brought to a natural end, concluding a near 3-month run, comprised of 22 episodes across 6 stories, before being closed off for good months later via the 5 Doctors, taking the total episode count to 23. Now, let's have a look at the story averages for this season. This is probably one of the most consistent seasons we've seen thus far in terms of viewing figures, just as Season 19 was, although this sadly has taken things one step lower. With no story being able to crack the 8 million mark, the winner in this run goes to the 20th anniversary special, The 5 Doctors, which doesn't come as any great surprise, but as stated, those numbers should have and could have been a lot higher. The least viewed story from Season 20 is the one directly before The 5 Doctors, The King's Demons, with 6.5 million watching on average. And whilst this isn't the worst result for a Who story, it isn't really that strong either, but considering my thoughts on The King's Demons, I'm not surprised it came last. Now, as we always do, let's work out the overall average for this season. By combining the average ratings for each story, we can calculate that the average viewing figures for Season 20 of Doctor Who stands at around roughly 7.1 million viewers, a staggering 2.2 million drop from the previous season average. This is one of the biggest average decreases that we've seen occur between seasons, and considering that it's happened with the 20th anniversary year, it's a true shame. This should have been the one year the overall average shot higher, not to fall lower. Still, to average just over 7 million across 7 adventures on your 20th birthday, you could be doing a lot worse, as for many other programmes that lasted as long, their audiences had dwindled and died out in a disastrous fashion. In terms of Season 20's position against the others, it sadly takes the spot of being the 3rd least viewed season of the 20 we've looked at so far. It had more viewership than Patrick Troughton and Tom Baker's final years as the Doctor, but the fact that it falls in the bottom 5 is a little worrying. Hopefully, as we continue, we'll see less of this chart, and more of the top-ranking seasons instead. Just to reiterate, looking at the two Peter Davison season averages, the viewership difference is honestly staggering. The fact over 2 million people decided to drop out of Doctor Who, whether it was from the 9-month gap, the increased competition with the arrival of Channel 4, strong offerings from ITV, whatever it was, it dented Doctor Who quite severely. But still, just to be clear, these numbers don't mean the programme is on its last legs, far from it. But if these deep drops continue to occur, then that ever-familiar television axe may loom over the TARDIS team. Season 20 had the mammoth task of celebrating Doctor Who's important birthday, not only with a regular run of adventures, but a 90-minute special that was to summarise everything the programme had achieved thus far. And despite any obstacles in their way, you can't deny that the production team achieved this goal to the best of their ability. Sure, not all of the stories are winners, some feel clunky, others feel dull, and some arguably could have been replaced with something a bit more interesting. Looking at you, King's Demons. But regardless, we got to see a returning friend or foe in every story, like the Brigadier, the Renegade Omega, or the malicious Mara, whilst also embarking on new kinds of adventures seen in stories like Mawdryn Undead and Enlightenment. And to top it off, we got a special that gave us all of the favourite monsters and companions, and all of the Doctors together at last. Well, sort of. But after all the dust had settled, and season 21 was fast approaching, how on earth could Doctor Who top what it had done in 1983? What kind of stories would we see next? And how would the Fifth Doctor meet his final end? The year is 1984, and Doctor Who was hot off the heels of its 20th anniversary. The celebrations on the whole were a resounding success, with massive events at Longleat, conventions occurring across the world, and of course the special episode to truly cement the occasion, The Five Doctors, was seen by nearly 8 million people in the UK, and managed to incorporate a slew of Doctors, companions and monsters into its 90-minute runtime. The 20th season, on the other hand, was debatably more of a mixed bag. Stories that weren't particularly thrilling, with viewing figures that were holding firm, but were a far cry from what the Fifth Doctor had started with. So for season 21, it was clear that some things had to change in order to try and raise that viewership once again. This would mean more returning monsters, some more abstract stories, and a finale that would see Peter Davison's incarnation of the beloved Time Lord went out with a bang, with a big surprise for viewers at the end. Speaking of Davison, this would be his third and final year as the Fifth Doctor, having made the decision to leave in the summer of 1983. Would this last run of adventures result in record-breaking viewing figures for this incarnation? Or on the flip side, would they continue to sink lower than ever before? Let's dive right in and find out. The first story from season 21 is Warriors of the Deep. The Doctor, Tegan and Turlough land on Seabase 4, an underwater military installation. The base is attacked by the Silurians and Sea Devils, who intend to provoke a devastating nuclear conflict that will wipe out humanity. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 5th of January 1984 and concluded on the 13th of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and this certainly isn't a bad start, but I'm longing for the show to crack 8 million again. It feels like it's been forever. 3 of the story's 4 episodes fall within the 7 million range, Part 1 proving to be the story's peak, with 7.6 million viewers tuning in to see the start of season 21. Part 4 records the lowest showing, with a loss of 1 million viewers, finishing with 6.6 million. Not the best when your first story falls into that range, but hey, it's early days. Things could change on a dime. When looking at the top 40 TV programmes, the season opener missed out on a place in the chart, although it did come closer than a lot of stories in season 20 ever did. Parts 1 and 2 come the closest, charting at 51st and 52nd respectively, whilst Part 4 falls the furthest away, finishing up at 87th place. So, after coming fresh off the heels of The Five Doctors, how come Warriors of the Deep wasn't able to bring the programme's viewing figures back up to new heights? Well, for one, Doctor Who continued to be broadcast twice a week, but now shifting from Tuesdays and Wednesdays to Thursdays and Fridays, at the slightly earlier time of 6:40 PM. With this new allocation in mind, we must now turn to one of the main factors that we look at this series, competition. Just a quick note, even though Channel 4 was a competitor, I won't be focusing on it much as we go forward. Similar to BBC 2, its viewership was always generally lower than BBC 1 or ITV, and I feel it would be concise to focus on the corporation's oldest rival. With that said, what did ITV have to combat Doctor Who this time around? Well, the bulk of the episodes would primarily go against long-running soap opera Crossroads, which itself was entering its 20th year on the air. The last 5 minutes of a Doctor Who episode at this time would face such programmes as Knight Rider and Emmerdale Farm on Thursdays, but on the Fridays would be a truly fierce competitor. The US hit action show, The A-Team, was proving extremely popular with UK audiences. This show had gone against the Five Doctors 2 months prior, and was arguably a major factor into the special's lower than expected viewing figures. As a result, viewing figures for Doctor Who episodes on Fridays would be generally lower than those that went out on a Thursday. But if competition was strong, how did the promotional arm of the BBC help the programme? Well, sadly, they weren't getting much help in the leading listings magazine, the Radio Times. By this point, the publication had stopped printing synopses for each story, instead focusing on just providing the cast list. There wasn't much outside press for the show's return either. However, on TV, Doctor Who was far from absent. Coinciding with BBC One's New Year lineup, Warriors of the Deep, as well as other Season 21 stories, were featured heavily in several trailers that were aired constantly during the first few days of 1984. This certainly would have helped drum up interest, but considering the season opener contained the return of not one, but two classic monsters, more promotion could have definitely been warranted. However, no amount of promotion could have assisted this story when it came to the numerous issues that plagued its production. In the early days of shooting, Prime Minister of the day, Margaret Thatcher, called for a general election. Such an event would demand lots of BBC studio time, and as a result, Warriors of the Deep lost 2 weeks of its production schedule. And whilst the team managed to get the season opener finished and ready to air, the rushed elements of the programme are there for all to see. No more so than the dreaded Merca, the secret weapon of the Silurians and Sea Devils. This poor creature looks unfinished. The paint on it is still wet, and the puppeteers inside had no time to practice operating it. What could have been a really menacing addition to the serial just comes off as being one of the most laughable monsters that Doctor Who has ever dared broadcast to its viewers. Warriors of the Deep itself is a good story, but one that sadly doesn't achieve all it can be due to the variety of issues. Focusing on the positives, the main attraction of course is the return of the Silurians and Sea Devils, who hadn't appeared on the show for 14 and 12 years respectively. They sport new designs, which received a mixed reaction from viewers, but to see them team up must have been quite exciting for audiences in 1984, especially those that were old enough to remember them the first time around. The three regulars are also on top form, with Peter and Janet in particular feeling really at home in these characters, with Mark Strickson as Turlough not far behind them. If you look past all of the production issues, a very hokey side monster, and a rushed conclusion, then there is still lots to enjoy about Warriors of the Deep, but it's such a shame that had the studio time not been lost, then we could have been treated to an entirely different adventure. Overall, this story attracted an average of 7.3 million viewers, a 0.4 drop from the previous story. Whilst it's nice to see Season 21 start things off with an average of over 7 million, you can't help but think back to the 9 and 10 million showings that the Fifth Doctor was able to bring in just 2 years earlier. And considering this story came only 6 weeks after the Five Doctors, it's a shame that all the success and promotional hype from the 20th anniversary didn't fully carry over into this first story. Whether you enjoy seeing the Silurians and Sea Devils return, or get a good giggle out of the Merca, Warriors of the Deep, I would argue, is far from the worst Classic Who has to offer. And to see whether you agree with me or not, you can read the Target book from 1984, or an audio adaptation that was first released in 1995 as a single cassette, before being made available on CD in 2004. Another audio adaptation was released in 2006 as part of a limited edition set, Monsters of Earth, though the individual title is now available to download. To watch it, you have a standalone VHS release from 1995, or as part of a 3 DVD collection from 2008, where it was packaged with Doctor Who and the Silurians and the Sea Devils as part of the Beneath the Surface box set. Despite its glaring flaws, I maintain that Warriors of the Deep has a lot going for it. It's not my favourite story featuring the returning villains, nor one of my favourite Fifth Doctor outings, but it's one of those stories I can comfortably return to every now and then and still get some enjoyment out of. So definitely give it a go for yourself, just watch out you don't come into contact with the Merca. You'll get paint all over you for a start.
Doctor! There's nothing we can do!
We can't just leave him.
Face it, Tegan! He's drowned!
The second story from Season 21 is The Awakening. It's 1984 in the village of Little Hodcombe. A group of villagers are reenacting scenes from the English Civil War, but their war games have gone too far, manipulated by the evil influence of the alien Malus. This story is comprised of 2 episodes, which began airing on the 19th of January 1984 and concluded the following day on the 20th. Here are the individual viewing figures for both episodes, and talk about bouncing up and down all over the place. Part 1 starts things off with one of the strongest viewing figures in some time, with 7.9 million viewers joining the TARDIS team in Little Hodcombe. However, the very next day for Part 2, 1.3 million of those viewers have left, with now only 6.6 million viewers seeing how the adventure concluded. And when it comes to the top 40 programmes, you can clearly see how much of a difference a 1.3 million drop in viewership can make. Part 1 charts at 61st place, while Part 2 is miles away behind it at 84th. So the prevailing question here is, what on earth happened? How did The Awakening manage to lose over 1 million viewers in the space of just one day? I think the main answer to that question can be placed down to the competition, specifically over at ITV. Part 1 aired on a Thursday, once again either airing against the ITV News or popular soap opera Crossroads. Part 2 went out on a Friday and would face either the News, but more noticeably, against the A-Team. The popularity of the American import was high, and despite more households gradually acquiring VHS recorders, the devices were often rented, as the cost of them and the tapes they used were still fairly expensive in 1984. So those who enjoyed both Doctor Who and the A-Team had to face the age-old question of which programme would they watch. And when looking at the viewing figures, I think it's clear to see where a fair chunk of those viewers made their decision. It's not like audiences weren't aware of The Awakening, as the serial had had a decent amount of promotion thrown its way, a lot of it long before the story even was due for transmission. Viewers would have their first glimpse on the 10th of September 1983, as an outtake featuring a horse and cart would be featured in the Golden Egg Awards slot of the Noel Edmonds Late Late Breakfast Show. It's a great gag, and proved so popular it would be seen again in December as part of the programme's final edition that year, and furthermore, the monster featured in The Awakening, the Malus, was seen and promoted within a special Radio Times magazine which was dedicated to celebrating the show's 20th anniversary. The Malus would also be seen and featured as part of the numerous TV trailers that aired to promote Season 21, which hoped to entice audiences in their millions to once again join the Doctor on his travels. The Awakening itself is something of an oddity. It's a 50-minute adventure in 2 parts, and whilst the setting and costume work is great, part of me feels like it tries to achieve too much in such a short amount of time. I think the Malus is a great concept, the idea of it having influence over this village recreating war games is fascinating, but had it been 4 parts instead of 2, I think we could have really had a unique adventure on our hands. But despite this, a lot of people adore The Awakening. Whether it's for the lovely period costumes, or from the performances of the leading cast, it's certainly far from being a dull story, but one that I feel at least could have achieved even more with a bit more time. Overall, this story attracted an average of 7.3 million viewers, the same as the previous story. This is one of those rare occasions where we see 2 story averages neatly align with each other, and whilst it's reassuring to see that the numbers haven't dropped down any lower, it's also a bit gutting to see that Doctor Who wasn't getting any new viewers hooked in anytime soon. We also have some repeat data for you. The Awakening was selected as one of the stories to form a block of summer repeats that were to air in the July and August of 1984. Airing as one 50-minute compilation on the 20th of July, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, with 4.4 million viewers tuning in, a 2.9 million drop from the original broadcast. The lower figure, however, is typical for Doctor Who repeats in the summer months, partly due to the hot weather and lighter nights keeping people outside, but also down to the competition. Going against The Awakening this time were programmes such as Survival Special and the popular game show Winner Takes All. It may be a short and sweet adventure, but The Awakening still holds a lot of that quintessential Doctor Who charm that keeps it very watchable and very entertaining on many levels. To join in the war games of Little Hodcombe for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1985 or its audio adaptation from 2010. To watch it, the story was released with Frontios as part of a double-pack VHS from 1997, and when it was time to release it on DVD, it was paired with another story once again, this time with the Gunfighters as part of the Earth story set from 2011. If you're in the mood for a really short classic Who story, or wish to see some alien shenanigans go off in a small English village, then The Awakening will definitely scratch that very specific itch for you. It's only 50 minutes of your time, so make yourself a brew, throw on your costume, and get ready to play your part in the games.
Look out!
The third story from Season 21 is Frontios. The TARDIS is drawn down to Frontios, the planet which buries its own dead. There, the last members of the human race are fighting for survival, but beneath the surface, something sinister lurks. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 26th of January 1984 and concluded on the 3rd of February. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and we can sadly see that a recurring trend is taking place. The Thursday episodes, parts 1 and 3, have considerably higher viewing figures than parts 2 and 4 that aired on Fridays. Part 1 attains the story's peak of viewership, and indeed one of the highest audiences of season 21, with 8 million viewers tuning in. Part 3 isn't far behind it at 7.8 million, but then looking at the remaining episodes, Part 2 falls 2 million further behind, with 5.8 million, and then Part 4 records the smallest viewership, finishing off with just 5.6 million people switched on. And when we look over at the top 40 programs, the chart positions are all over the place. Parts 1 and 3 are fairly close together, at 58th and 59th place respectively, but parts 2 and 4 sink into triple-digit territory, finishing at a dismal 115th and 112th. So, with viewership for Frontios soaring upwards only to drop dramatically over its alternating episodes, what exactly was at work to cause this flux to happen? Once again, the primary reason could arguably be placed down to the competition that was being shown over at ITV. The other side would this time air Emmerdale Farm in some regions on Thursdays, but Fridays were still very much dominated by the A-Team, a show which was stealing viewers away from Doctor Who in droves. The fact that Frontios lost 2.2 million viewers in the space of just one day shows how powerful this competition was, but I think we also have to take in the possibility that audiences just weren't staying in during a Friday evening. With children done with school for the week and most adults having the weekend off work, I think it's reasonable to assume many were doing anything but watching the telly. Whether out with friends, going for a night on the town, travelling somewhere for the weekend, there's a whole cluster of potential factors that could additionally play into the lower viewing figures recorded for Fridays. On the promotional side of things, whilst clips from Frontios did feature in the lineup trailer showcasing season 21, this story didn't receive the same additional treatment that Warriors of the Deep or The Awakening did. In fact, the only major bout of publicity that happened for Frontios spawned from a rather tragic event. Peter Arn, a renowned actor who had appeared in many films and recently in the BBC's twice-weekly drama Triangle, was cast to play Mr. Range in this story. However, just hours after attending a costume fitting at the BBC for this character, Peter was brutally murdered in his own home at Knightsbridge. This tragedy was reported heavily in the mainstream media, with many reports making reference to Arn's upcoming role in Doctor Who. The part was hurriedly recast, with William Lucas ultimately playing Mr. Range, taking the role mere weeks before the cameras began rolling. Frontios is another example of a Doctor Who story that has some wonderful concepts and ideas, but ultimately doesn't pull them off to the greatest extent, at least in my opinion. The story was penned by former script editor Christopher H. Bidmead, a writer whose previous works for the programme I have strongly taken to. These include the Fourth Doctor's final story Legopolis, as well as the Fifth Doctor's debut in Castrovalva, and like those stories, there are so many elements of Frontios that I'm really intrigued by, but unlike those previous examples, I feel these elements are let down either by budgetary constraints or even some of the performances from the actors. The Tractators, whilst appearing somewhat comical, are a great villain, and it's so disappointing that they never got another outing on television. Some are just destined to be one-hit wonders, aren't they? Overall, this story attracted an average of 6.8 million viewers, a 0.5 drop from the previous story. To see a decrease this early on in the season is a little worrying, but this result is still somewhat acceptable by 1984 standards, though it remains a far cry from what Doctor Who was achieving a couple of years ago. So whilst not being a disaster and far from the lowest average, it's not one to rest all your faith into. Frontios shines out a little from the other stories of season 21, even if that's just on a conceptual level, but if you fancy some really good quality sci-fi work, then this will certainly do the job. Just be a little forgiving of some of the set pieces, including the poor old Tractators themselves. So if you're ready to journey to Frontios, you can read the Target book from 1984, or its audio adaptation from 2015. To watch it, there's the double pack VHS release from 1997, where Frontios was paired with The Awakening, or you can also experience the adventure via a standalone DVD release from 2011. It's not Christopher H. Bidmead's crowning achievement, but it's certainly not a firm failure, at least not in my eyes. If you're in the mood for more Tractator action specifically, you can check out The Hollows of Time, an audio drama written by Christopher and released by Big Finish Productions. Like all of the divisive or overlooked Who adventures, give Frontios another look in, and as I say with all of these forgotten ones, you may end up finding yourself a new favourite.
It's gone.
The TARDIS has been destroyed.
The fourth story from season 21 is Resurrection of the Daleks. The Daleks launch a plan to free Davros from his prison and restore their place as the supreme beings in the universe. What part does the Doctor play in their strategy? And will he destroy Davros in the process? This story is comprised of two 45-minute episodes, which began airing on the 8th of February 1984 and concluded the following week on the 15th. You may be wondering at the shift in transmission dates, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Here are the individual viewing figures for both episodes, and this is a nice improvement to say the least. There's no dramatic drop this time around, as both parts easily saw over 7 million viewers, with part 2 pulling in 8 million, now tying with the opening installment of Frontios as the most watched episode of season 21 thus far. It seems that despite moving intended transmission dates and broadcasting over 2 consecutive weeks as opposed to 2 consecutive days, something there was clearly working. For the top 40 TV programs, despite the improved performance, both parts failed to gain a place within the chart. Part 2 came the closest, at 53rd place, whilst Part 1 fell 20 positions lower, at 73rd. So with viewing figures holding steady and rising, as opposed to jumping up and down with each episode, what was it about Resurrection of the Daleks that helped it achieve this positive result? Well, first and foremost, let's address the scheduling changes. Due to the BBC's extensive coverage of the 1984 Winter Olympics in Sarajevo, Doctor Who's regular time slots on Thursdays and Fridays were not available. Rather than have a mid-season break of a few weeks, the decision was made to air Resurrection of the Daleks over 2 Wednesdays, taking the initial 4-part story and combining it to make 2 45-minute long episodes, the first time Doctor Who broadcast episodes of this length. Due to the success of the serial, with viewers and in the ratings, it's often cited that this was one of the main factors in how the format of Doctor Who would change the following year for season 22, but more on that when we get there. The double-length episodes went against more regimented competition over on ITV. 45 minutes of Dalek action crossed over with popular soap Crossroads, before facing the game show Name That Tune, before finally overlapping slightly with the other side's oldest and most renowned programme, Coronation Street. Considering all 3 of these opponents were highly rated by audiences, the fact that Resurrection was able to not only hold but increase its viewership over its 2-week run is very impressive. The promotional efforts for this serial certainly helped out too. After a near 5-year absence, the Daleks were finally returning properly to face the Doctor once again. Given that the Pepper Potts were still the most iconic and popular Who monster, their presence was almost guaranteed to bring in an increased viewership. In fact, the return of the Metal Monsters was due to have its very own front cover on the Radio Times, the first time a Dalek story would have done so since 1972. However, due to the Winter Olympics coverage, this sadly didn't happen, though almost as a compromise, the publicity photo taken for the front cover was used for the inside back cover of the listings magazine. Furthermore, the back page space was also dedicated to Resurrection of the Daleks. Promotional efforts were also strong on TV. On the day of Part 1's broadcast, a Dalek popped up in the Breakfast Time studio to help promote the story, and a very brief clip of Part 1 was glimpsed by viewers, as a section of the Season 21 trailers that were circulated in early 1984. Resurrection also got its own dedicated trailer, in which the announcers boasted that this tale was a double-length affair. A factor combined with the return of the Daleks must have drummed up some considerable excitement. Resurrection is such a standout adventure from the Fifth Doctor's era. Some believe for how it excels in many areas, whereas others believe it's far too excessive, needlessly violent, and suffers from cramming too many ideas into a tight-knit structure. I personally absolutely adore the story. The Daleks once again feel like a bona fide threat, something which was arguably lacking in their last few appearances, and we're also treated to the return of their creator, Davros, this time around played by Terry Malloy. Whilst many love Michael Wish's original portrayal, Terry Malloy for me at least feels like the quintessential classic Davros. Quiet and manipulative when needed, whilst also having the capacity to completely lose it, channeling the maniacal insanity of his creations. There's a lot more you could dissect about Resurrection, but it's definitely one of those classic Who stories that deserves your attention. It's one that you won't forget in a hurry. Overall, this story attracted an average of 7.7 million viewers, a 0.9 increase from the previous story. It's pretty clear that all of the contributing factors mentioned earlier absolutely paid off. The barrage of promotion for the return of the Daleks, the double-length nature of both episodes, it's almost a surprise that the ratings weren't boosted even higher. But there is one key factor of this serial that seems to have been largely overlooked in the run-up to Resurrection's transmission. After 3 years aboard the TARDIS, their encounter with the Daleks proves to be the final straw for long-standing companion, Tegan. The final scene of the story, in which she leaves the Doctor, is one that is gloomy, downbeat, and very heartfelt. Janet Fielding, together with Peter Davison, gives some of the best performances of the era, and like the Doctor proclaims, you wish she hadn't left like this. But I feel this sad parting is indeed earned. After all of the death and destruction featured in the story, combined with what Tegan has encountered and experienced over the past 3 years, it's no surprise to believe that she has indeed had enough. Whilst her character begged for even more development than it got on her time on the show, Tegan's departure still stands as one of the most memorable of the classic series. And if you wish to see this exit, as well as all of the action crammed into this rollercoaster of a story, then you can read the BBC Books release from 2019, or its audio adaptation released the same year. You can also pick it up to read via the Target Book style release from 2021. To watch it, the 4-part version was released as a standalone VHS in 1993, before being re-released on the format in 2001, this time as part of the Davros Collection set. Jumping ahead to DVD, the adventure was first released in its 4-part form in 2002, before being included as part of numerous special edition sets. The Dalek Collector's Edition, exclusive to W.H. Smith's in 2003, the Dalek Collection exclusive to Amazon in 2007, and later that same year, the Davros Collection, which was limited to 10,000 copies. Finally, in 2011, the story was remastered and re-released to DVD again, this time as a special edition, as part of the Revisitations 2 box set, in which both the 4-part and the original 2-part versions are included. Resurrection of the Daleks may not be a favourite to everyone, but for me it stands as one of the most unique and most entertaining stories of the classic series, and certainly one of my favourites from the Peter Davison years. It may have a higher body count than the original Terminator, but if you're in the mood for a darker, more morbid Doctor Who story, then Resurrection of the Daleks will fit that mood in a heartbeat.
Take cover!
Exterminate! 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 Exterminate!
The 5th story from Season 21 is Planet of Fire. When Chameleon falls under the control of a psychic signal, the TARDIS is drawn down first to Earth, and then the planet Sarn. An old enemy is at work, and Turlough's mysterious past is catching up with him. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 23rd of February 1984 and concluded on the 2nd of March. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and whilst the numbers seem to have fallen slightly, they certainly are more stable than many of the previous stories from Season 21. Parts 1 and 3, both Thursday episodes, hold the peak of the story's viewership, with 7.4 million tuning in. Part 4 dips slightly to bang on 7 million, whilst Part 2 almost falls a million lower, finishing off with 6.1 million viewers, which also serves as the story's weakest point. When looking at the top 40 programmes, no episode is able to crack said chart, with Part 3 charting the highest at 67th. Part 1 a few spots behind at 71st, and Part 4 a few steps further behind at 74th. Part 2, however, completely falls out of the top 100, entering triple digits and charting at 102nd for the week. So after the buzz created from the return of the Daleks, how come Planet of Fire didn't manage to attain the same or even greater success in the ratings? Well, let's start off with competition. As Planet of Fire began, Doctor Who was back on Thursday and Friday nights, the double-length episodes on Wednesdays seemingly being a one-off for now. As such, on Thursdays, the programme was back to facing a lot of the competition it had faced earlier in the season. This included Crossroads, various regional news programmes, and the start of Emmerdale Farm, which was generally networked in every ITV region, bar London, where Thames Television began showing episodes of the US show Knight Rider. Friday nights changed things up a little more. Numerous regions continued to show the A-Team against Doctor Who, though for Part 4, Mr. T and co were swapped out for the game show Give Us a Clue. However, many ITV regions had abandoned the A-Team altogether, instead deciding to show a brand new light-hearted show, The Zodiac Game, which would only end up lasting for 2 seasons. We saw from the numbers earlier that the dip in viewership for Friday nights was nowhere near as drastic compared to the first few stories of Season 21, and I think factors such as the A-Team eventually disappearing from the schedules certainly assisted in that. Promotion, however, had a massive opportunity to step things up for Doctor Who, namely due to the arrival of a brand new companion, Peri Brown, played by Nicola Bryant. Many newspapers did carry articles, with several featuring interviews with Nicola herself. There was also a feature for her debut on BBC One's Breakfast Time, which went out on the morning of Part 1's broadcast. A new companion typically drew attention from the press and the public, but Planet of Fire would also see yet another departure, one which barely seemed to gain any coverage at all. Hot off the heels of Tegan's exit in the previous story, Planet of Fire saw the departure of Turlough, him deciding to stay on the planet Sarn. Mark Strickson puts in a good performance, but I can't help but feel the whole manner of him leaving feels a great deal more rushed and out of nowhere than Tegan's ever did. Having said that, he does get a decent story to bow out on, for not only do we see Peri join the TARDIS team, we also witness the return of the Doctor's arch-nemesis, the Master, played once more by Anthony Ainley. Some of the effects featuring the evil Time Lord are quite impressive for 1984 standards, and the final confrontation between the Master and the Doctor feels quite high stakes in how it's directed and played out. We also see the return and subsequent demise of Chameleon, the robot who joined the TARDIS at the end of Season 20 and presumably sat in a cupboard somewhere until this adventure. The action involving Chameleon makes no attempt to hide the fact that the production team wanted him gone and gone fast. And indeed, he does meet his end, at the Doctor's hand no less, towards the conclusion of the serial. Planet of Fire is definitely a mixed bag for me. Whilst it's enjoyable to see Perry join the TARDIS, to see the Master come back, and even some of the Chameleon stuff I don't mind, but a lot of the time I find myself admiring the gorgeous Lanzarote landscapes rather than what's actually going on story-wise. Doctor Who going abroad in the classic series often felt like such a milestone, and that was indeed often reflected in the publicity. Just look at City of Death from 1979, or Arc of Infinity from 1983. But this time, the Lanzarote location work was barely mentioned in the mainstream press, perhaps only being hotly covered within the pages of the dedicated Doctor Who magazine. However, things were only due to get even hotter and more intense for the Fifth Doctor, but more on that when we get there. Overall, this story attracted an average of 7 million viewers, a 0.7 drop from the previous story. Some could have said that the drop right after a Dalek story is inevitable, but nevertheless, after all of the hype from Resurrection, it's a shame a chunk of audience members didn't decide to continue with Doctor Who as it returned to its twice-weekly slot. Planet of Fire may be far from the greatest Master story, or even from being considered a true classic by the masses, but having said that, it does have a lot going for it. Whether it's the handling of both the companion arrival and departure, the stunning filming work in Lanzarote, or some of the best confrontational scenes in the Fifth Doctor's era, you have an adventure that will deliver the goods. To jet off to Lanzarote with the TARDIS team for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1984, but there's no audio adaptation as of yet. To watch it, you have a VHS release from 1998, or a DVD release from 2010, packaged together with The King's Demons as part of the Chameleon Tales box set. Planet of Fire serves as a curious penultimate adventure for the Fifth Doctor, and whilst it is jam-packed with a lot of strong elements, for me, not all of them are firing off on all cylinders. However, one constant is Peter Davison and his portrayal of the lead character. By this point, he truly feels like he knows who this particular incarnation is and what he wishes to do with it, and that will only continue to reach new depths with what would prove to be the Fifth Doctor's final trip in the TARDIS.
3 months, you say?
That's right.
All right. Why not? Welcome aboard, Perry.
The sixth story from Season 21, and the final adventure for the Fifth Doctor, is the Caves of Androzani. Caught in the middle of a war for control of an anti-aging drug on the planet Androzani Minor, the Doctor and Perry battle to stay alive against gunrunners, corrupt politicians, and psychopaths. Time is running out for the Doctor. This story is comprised of 4 episodes, which began airing on the 8th of March 1984 and concluded on the 16th of the same month. Here are the individual viewing figures for all 4 episodes, and we've got a somewhat mixed result for the Fifth Doctor's final adventure. Parts 1 and 2 pulled in 6.9 and 6.6 million viewers respectively, the latter being the least viewed episode of the story's run. However, Parts 3 and 4 do pick things up again, both of them managing to bring in 7.8 million viewers, one of the strongest figures of Season 21. So at least when Peter Davison did bow out, it was with one of the strongest audiences of the year for the programme. For the top 40 charts, Doctor Who doesn't crack the top 40, and the best performers, Parts 3 and 4, both stall at 62nd place. Part 1 isn't too far behind at 66th, and Part 2 falls down the charts the furthest, finishing up at 75th. So, with the stakes being incredibly high for this swan song, why didn't the Caves of Androzani manage to push the viewing figures into some new heights? The competition over at ITV remained fierce during the story's run, but now the mighty pull of the A-Team was nowhere to be found. Thursday night opponents ranged from old stalwarts such as Crossroads, before segueing into the network's newest US import, Knight Rider. Starring David Hasselhoff, this show had ended up gaining quite a popular following all its own, and undoubtedly swayed some of the viewers away to ITV. On Fridays, with the A-Team gone, the Zodiac game continued to take place in many regions. However, those that weren't showing the game show instead opted to show another US import, that being drama series The Fall Guy. It's fascinating that after 2 decades, ITV still felt that some of the best programming to go against Doctor Who was a mixture of either US imports or light entertainment. If it ain't broke, then don't fix it, I suppose. The promotion for Caves of Androzani was prevalent, but not as widespread as the last few regeneration stories arguably were. A TV trailer was aired the day before Part 1's broadcast, and articles popped up in various publications, either highlighting new companion Perry or the imminent departure of Peter Davison and the incoming debut of Colin Baker. Speaking of the new Doctor, he was gearing up for a whole host of promotional appearances himself, some of which came just after the Caves of Androzani concluded, so more on that when we get there. But ultimately, considering the fanfare made for the departures of Doctors like Jon Pertwee and Tom Baker, I'm honestly a little surprised that the coverage for the final story for the Fifth Doctor wasn't emphasised more, especially since Doctor Who was fresh off the promotional and commercial hype and success of its 20th anniversary year. Nevertheless, the Caves of Androzani serves as one of the finest examples not just of a regeneration story, but how to wonderfully pull off a Doctor Who story in general. Former script editor Robert Holmes returns to pen the serial, and despite having not written for the show in 6 years, it not only feels like he's never been away, but it stands as one of his finest pieces of Who material. It's a deliciously dark and morbid tale, one filled with high-stakes drama and some absolutely standout performances from many of the cast. Sharaz Jek as a villain may be easy to compare to the Phantom of the Opera, but the way he is portrayed by Christopher Gable is incredible. And all of the drama and tension builds to an absolutely stellar finale, one in which the Doctor is not fighting to save his companion's life, but his own as well. Even after going to the greatest of lengths to do so, the Time Lord in the end must still pay the ultimate price. Overall, this story attracted an average of 7.3 million viewers, a 0.3 increase from the previous story. It's great to see more audience members return for a Doctor Swansong adventure, but considering that this incarnation started his run with audiences of 9 to 10 million viewers, it's a tragedy that he couldn't bow out with the same amount of viewership. We also have some repeat data for you. During Doctor Who's 30th anniversary in 1993, the Caves of Androzani would form part of a repeat season that would air over on BBC Two. Going out over 4 consecutive Fridays from the 19th of February to the 12th of March, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which average out at 1.82 million viewers, a 5.48 million drop from the original broadcast. This is a criminally low figure for a story this good, but we have to acknowledge the factors at play. First and foremost, Doctor Who wasn't airing new episodes for the majority of the 1990s, and despite this being early into the programme's 30th anniversary, its public profile had shrunk down immensely, now mainly being kept alive by the dedicated fanbase. Furthermore, BBC Two is a channel that has always typically had lower audiences compared to BBC One, and by 1993, many UK viewers not only had access to terrestrial television, but to hundreds of channels via the use of satellite. So, with weakened mainstream profile and the addition of seemingly endless competition, no wonder this repeat came out with the figures it did. The Caves of Androzani, both back then and indeed now, is still revered as one of the greatest Doctor Who stories of all time. Whether it's the masterful, action-orientated direction from Graham Harper, the excellent performances from Davison, Bryant and Gable, or the cracking good story from one of the series' most esteemed writers, and you have all of the ingredients for a masterpiece. And if you want to experience said story for yourself, you can read the Target book from 1984, or its audio adaptation from 2018. To watch it, you have the standalone VHS release from 1992, the original DVD release from 2001, or the special edition re-release from 2010, as part of the Revisitations 1 box set. Whether you're a fan of Peter Davison's Doctor or not, I think few would find it hard to deny how brilliant the Caves of Androzani is. It serves as the most fitting end to this incarnation of the Time Lord, a man who may not have had the most instant domineering presence his predecessors had, but one who wasn't afraid to be a bit more vulnerable, a bit more compassionate, and in many respects, a bit more human. And his sacrifice, using the only vial of bat's milk to save his friend and not himself, perfectly encapsulates what this Doctor stood for, that he was a good man, and that he most certainly was a hero. So that's season 21 for the Fifth Doctor, the 6 stories that comprise it, and the ratings that they garnered. With the transmission of episode 4 of the Caves of Androzani, Peter Davison's time on season 21 came to a close, concluding a run of just over 2 months, comprised of 20 episodes across 6 stories. Now, let's have a look at the story averages for this season. Very much like season 20 before it, the averages for season 21 are consistent for the most part. The clear victor is Resurrection of the Daleks, which had an average of 7.7 million viewers tuning in, but as discussed, factors such as the return of the Daleks and the double-length nature of the 2 episodes arguably helped achieve this boost. The least viewed story of season 21 is Frontios, with an average of 6.8 million, which is far from disastrous, but stands out as the sole story from the run to fall under 7 million viewers. All the remaining serials do fall within the range, and whilst Doctor Who may not have been anywhere close to 10 million viewers in 1984, the results arguably show that if anything, the programme still retained an extremely loyal following. Now, as we always do, let's work out the overall average for this season. By combining the average ratings for each story, we can calculate that the average viewing figures for season 21 of Doctor Who stands at around roughly 7.2 million viewers. This is a slight increase from what we saw season 20 achieve, just a 0.1 increase in fact, but whilst it is disappointing that we don't see a major jump, it is reassuring to see that at least the viewership was holding firm for the most part. The fact that just over 7 million viewers on average were still tuning into Doctor Who week after week, nearly 21 years after its very first episode, that's a sure sign of a national staple if I ever saw one. When we put this against the previous 20 seasons in terms of ranking, Season 21 ranks as the 4th least viewed, sharing that spot with both Seasons 5 and 7. This I feel puts into perspective that while 7.2 million is far from disastrous, for it to place in the bottom 5 shows that for Doctor Who's track record, it's a little worrying. When compared to the previous 2 years, Season 21 places second overall in the 5th Doctor's era, gaining just 0.1 million higher than Season 20, but remaining miles behind first place, which is Season 19, by around 2.1 million viewers. It is a shame to see the numbers drop so heavily after the 5th Doctor's first year on the air, but as we've discussed, numerous factors played into this. The hype of a new Doctor wearing off, the show constantly changing days and time slots for transmission, the mixed reaction to the televised stories, strong competition from ITV, the introduction of Channel 4, all of these factors could have contributed to the average viewership seeing this sharp decline. However, the fact that said average held at just over 7 million across 1983 and 1984 is a positive. We haven't yet descended to below that mark. And hopefully, with the 6th Doctor coming in, this danger zone would continue to be avoided. But more on that when we get there. But now, as we've reached the end of another Doctor's era, it's time we got really nerdy with numbers and figure out the overall average for the Peter Davison years. By combining the results achieved from seasons 19 to 21, we can calculate that the average viewing figures for the Peter Davison era of Doctor Who stands at around roughly 7.9 million viewers. Together with William Hartnell's time, this is the joint 3rd most watched era of the programme thus far, falling 0.4 million behind the Pertwee years and 1.5 million behind Tom Baker's 7-year stint. It may be in 3rd place, but it is worth noting that the Davison era had a lot less adventures than its immediate predecessor. Whereas Tom Baker had over 40 televised stories, Peter Davison only had 20 by comparison, meaning that he has the least amount of serials overall on our journey thus far. So had the viewing figures achieved in his 3 years been lower than what we got, it could have dragged down the overall era average considerably. Season 21 in a way had a lot of pressure placed upon it. It had to follow the mammoth event of the 20th anniversary and prove that Doctor Who not only had a lot of fresh life in it, but that it could still deliver new and exciting adventures for audiences young and old. Did it succeed with every attempt this year? Arguably not, but what we do get is a bunch of stories that weren't afraid to push the boundaries just a little bit further. The dark, grim tones of Resurrection of the Daleks or Caves of Androzani, the simplistic yet intriguing settings of The Awakening or Planet of Fire, and even stories that many consider to be duds, like Warriors of the Deep, I would always argue that they contain elements that work to their strengths. This was the kind of storytelling the 5th Doctor needed as a character, to develop further and to give him the best send-off possible, which is arguably what he got. And while seeing the 6th Doctor's first adventure is a real treat to conclude the season, this is very much Peter Davison's year. It's this season where I believe he truly gives many of his best performances as the Doctor, getting across that relatable vulnerability whilst retaining much of what viewers had come to love the Time Lord for. His time on the show may have seemed brief compared to others, but he delivered an incarnation that is just as beloved as his predecessors. But as season 21 concluded, a new man was in control of the TARDIS, and viewers would have to wait an agonising 9 months to find out just where he would end up next. And just like that, Peter Davison's time as the Doctor had come to an end. Over the 3 years in which he piloted the TARDIS, the programme had been injected with a new lease of life. Audiences soared dramatically to 9, sometimes 10 million viewers, and the quality of the stories in that first year are some of the best that Classic Who has to offer. Peter's prior popularity with audiences helped usher Doctor Who into the 1980s with relative ease, and even though that initial boom wore off for his remaining 2 years, the programme retained its following strongly enough to avoid ever coming near the chopping block. It was Peter's Doctor that spearheaded the 20th anniversary celebrations, giving fans the chance to meet the stars, and with the 5 Doctors, deliver an adventure that appealed to everyone in some way, shape or form. His final year offered viewers darker stories, adventures with perhaps even more ambition than what had come before, no more exemplified than with this swan song, The Caves of Androzani. And as Peter Davison became Colin Baker, the former, just like his four predecessors, walked away from the TARDIS onto pastures new. Peter remained a very successful actor for much of the 1980s, but he never truly distanced himself away from Doctor Who in the same way that Tom Baker had initially done. He appeared frequently at conventions, charity events, and was more than happy to appear in the pseudo 30th anniversary special, Dimensions in Time. I've already talked about this beast in depth, but we'll come to it in this series eventually. Peter was also one of the first classic Doctors to reprise his incarnation for Big Finish, who began producing audio adventures for the series in 1999 and continue to do so to this day. Perhaps most notably, Peter returned to TV screens as the Fifth Doctor for a charity minisode called Time Crash, which aired as part of Children in Need 2007. This escapade saw him team up with 10th Doctor David Tennant, who would eventually become his son-in-law, but more on that when we get there. For the programme's 50th anniversary in 2013, Peter was the director and driving force behind the comedy adventure, The Five-ish Doctors reboot, in which together with Colin Baker and Sylvester McCoy, they delivered half an hour of laughs and wit that would make any Doctor Who fan joyous to no end. I think it's fair to say that in many numerous respects, Peter Davison was, and still very much is, the Doctor, playing the part with the same vigour and enthusiasm just as he had done almost 40 years ago. He remains a firm fan favourite to this day. So those are the ratings details for the Fifth Doctor's entire era. I hope you enjoyed this numerical look back at 3 years that in many ways was so crucial to the show's survival. Not only was the programme reinvigorated for the 1980s, but Peter Davison and his various companions became icons to a whole new generation of fans, many of whom would end up working on Doctor Who in the decades to come. If you want to check out more Doctor Who content, then I highly recommend the following creators: Jack Reeves, Philip Hawkins, and Dominic G. Martyn, known on YouTube as Who Chaser. If you want to read more about Doctor Who and the making of it, then I highly recommend the Complete History series of books, which I used as reference for this video. If you want to keep up to date with this series, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and if you want to see new episodes of the series early, then you can by supporting us on Patreon or via my Ko-fi page. Please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and leaving your thoughts on the Peter Davison era in the comments section below. I've been Adam Martyn from AMTV, and we'll see you next time for the Colin Baker years.